So we're really thrilled to be involved in the organisation of this year's event, and we hope that it will be similarly successful in learning from you all and bringing together, helping to support the kind of growth of this community working on such important topics. So on behalf of the EE group, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and we'll hand over to John from the POID perspective.
Yeah, so I should say, yeah, so thanks to everybody for coming here. I'm Director of Programme on Innovation Diffusion, POID, and the most important thing, we're funded by the UK RI and the Economic and Social Research Council. So they have helped provide some of the money for that, so thank you if you're listening. And it wouldn't be possible without you, so that's the main thing. And of course, thanks to everybody here. We'll do more of that later on. But I just think it's super exciting that we have, part of the movement idea is to get people involved who may not see themselves like myself as environmental economists, but a broader range of economists working on the most important issue of our time. So that's part of the aim of what we're doing here. Okay, thanks. That's what we'll end up with.
By just welcoming everyone, and I guess I'm going to make two main points. First is that to the extent possible, we try to come to everyone. Speak of the fact that actually it's interesting where you pick up ideas in academic sessions, it could be a policy session, it could be a master lecture, an evening event. So I think for me, the kind of parallel environment week, the sort of development took off in the world, and that sort of was a form of people coming together regularly in that environment. Because we're coming from many different parts of economics, just sort of mingling as much as possible, seeing as much as different events. It's kind of total immersion, a request for total immersion in and then on a more practical note, Jonathan Leap, who's the executive director of IGC, one of the directors, would like to sort of encourage project generation. So IGC, the International Growth Centre, which is housed in the economics department, has, I think, 12 offices across the world, in the Middle East, in Africa, South Asia, working principally with government. But we have a call for proposals this month, and we're particularly encouraging young researchers, PhD students, young and older researchers to submit proposals. And as a means of sort of encouraging that, you may not know a lot about work going on in Pakistan, in Ghana. There's going to be a session on Tuesday lunchtime between 12:30 and 1:30 where you can hear about what the interests of those countries are, and sort of a matchmaking session. And then you'll be emailed the names and contact details of the country, IGC country. So these offices have young economists of your vintage working and trying to create projects with governments and others. So we're going to try to use the week to sort of get more work done there. Of course, Environment Week is much broader, it covers the whole world. But I thought I just should plug that a little bit. And then there'll be a set of office hours on the afternoon of Tuesday and then going forward, where you can actually meet one-on-one with the country and discuss, is there a project that I could get started? That will end and pass it on to the presenter. Thank you.
Great. So just a few house rules while we present. So we have 5 presentations in this first session. We will then have a master lecture and policy session on urbanization in the afternoon. So for these sessions, there are 15-minute presentations. The rule is no questions unless the speaker opens up for questions. So we'll depart and try to stay on time. But without further ado, Anna is our first.
It's lovely to be here. Thank you for the chance to come and tell you about this project. Please do ask me clarifying questions. If you have a question about why I didn't write a completely different paper, please save that for later. Questions, please do. Okay, so this is a project we've been working on for a long time about the link between participation and sustainability. There's been a lot of people involved in this project along the way. I don't really have time to tell you who they all are by name, but just to say it's taken a village to get here. So this is a project about infrastructure. And the way I think about infrastructure is that infrastructure is kind of underlying everything we think about the economy doing, whether it's firms or people. It makes possible the choices that people make in their lives. We can think about all different kinds of infrastructure, but it's still, most assessments say it's woefully unprovided in much of the world. So if you look at, this is just access to safe drinking water, we can look at the same statistics for anything, any other kind of infrastructure you like. There are still just many people in the world, billions of people in the world who still lack adequate access to infrastructure. And a problem that we get from reading the policy literature or from experience is that even when infrastructure has been successfully installed, it often falls kind of rapidly into disrepair. And a feature of the way policy is designed is that responsibility for maintenance and repair of infrastructure often lies with the beneficiary communities themselves, and it is especially true in rural areas. And so then, and I'm not claiming this is underlying this whole pattern, but then if we look across the world, it's very clear that rural areas really lag way behind urban areas in terms of having access to infrastructure. I'm not claiming that that's all. So how do we fix this problem? How do we improve maintenance? There's this idea out there in policy, and it's been a highly influential idea in the last sort of couple of decades, is that communities should participate in the design, financing, or construction of projects. And this is sort of the link between participation and sustainability is sort of a little bit vague. It's not particularly clearly theorized. People have this idea that if you participated somehow, the projects might be better targeted, they might be closer to people's needs. You might have people might have skin in the game. They might have a sense of ownership is the magical wand that people would like people to have waved by being involved in the participation. Then they're going to keep maintaining it later on. But this policy prescription, Mansouri and Rao wrote this wonderful review back in 2013, and they said this whole idea is based more on ideology and optimism than actually concrete evidence. So whether or not participation actually affects sustainability is not a question that we have really any rigorous evidence on. There are two problems. The first problem is that participatory projects differ from non-participatory projects in other respects, and that's going to bias comparisons between them if you're trying to learn from cross-sectional data or you're trying to learn from case studies. And the second problem is that, well, long-run data are super rare. Like most of our follow-ups to our experiments, world is changing a little bit now, and people are working on these long-run projects, but historically, people have been looking at follow-ups of 1 to 2 years after a project's completed. So what we're going to try and do in this project is answer the question of whether or not participation increases sustainability. We're going to use randomized experiments to identify causal effects, and we're going to assemble a 15-year panel of data tracking what happens in projects we've implemented to solve the data. Okay. So the context in which we're working is the arsenic problem in Bangladesh. So this is a naturally occurring problem. Arsenic occurs in the shallow groundwater in Bangladesh. Smith et al. Back in 2000 called it the largest poisoning of a population in history. It's sort of a noxious problem. It's invisible, it doesn't smell, it's undetectable in water except through chemical tests. It doesn't affect the taste of the water, and it's a bioaccumulant. So it builds up in your body, and eventually you get sick sort of 10 or 15 years down the line. So it's a huge problem. What people have proposed, the solution is technically simple. You just dig a deeper well. Like if you dig deep enough, you can get into a layer of groundwater that's tens of thousands of years old, and anything noxious that was in it has been filtered out over years of moving through the ground. So the solution is technically simple, but it's also costly. Digging that deep is expensive. And so what people have tried to do in the past is build wells designed to serve communities with safe water. And so what we've been doing, we've been working in 3 different locations over, it was a 10-year period during which we were building wells. And in total, we built 622 wells in 258 communities over a 10-year period. So, and the study nests 2 experiments and also some wells that were built under non-experimental conditions, which we throw into some of our analyses just to kind of give us a bigger picture. Okay. So over the years, we went back to these wells over and over again. You can detect from the shape of this graph that this was not a project that we planned out perfectly 15 years ago. This has been, moments when we had funding, or when there was a few years where we couldn't do anything, or the COVID pandemic went on. But essentially, whenever we had a bit of money, we went back and looked at these wells. So over these years, we conducted about 3,109 well condition assessments. And then we can accumulate this into a panel of data up to 15 years after construction. On average, we observe wells about every 3 years in their lifetime. What I'm going to focus on today is functionality, like a very simple and basic definition of sustainability, which is whether or not the well is functioning. What that means is you're able to collect 7 liters of water from the well. 7 liters sounds like a super random number, but anyone who's been in Bangladesh knows that this is the size of a culchi, like a water vessel that everybody uses to put water. So if it's not functional, what does it mean? Sometimes the well's been destroyed. The land is valuable in Bangladesh, so someone might have, gotten sick of having this well there and wanted to build something else in the land. Hydrogeological conditions might have made the well useless. If the groundwater turns saline, the well rusts up from the inside. There's nothing anybody can do to prevent it. And then the last reason, the one that we really think about when we're thinking about sustainability, is that the well may not have been maintained or repaired over time. So I said we're going to talk about two experiments. The first experiment is about participation in decision making. So what we have is what I'm going to talk about today are two decision-making models. One is where our field staff took all decisions about the number and the location of wells. So they did their best to solve the potential information problems. They spent a couple of days in the community, getting to know everyone, asking people about conditions in the community to find out where would be a good idea. The community always chooses whether or not to participate. We can't force anybody to accept the project, but the field staff take all the key decisions. And then the second treatment arm we have is one where communities take decisions by unanimous consensus at meetings. The meetings have participation requirements for women of the poor, and we have field staff facilitating those meetings and making sure that those rules get followed. In that experiment, everybody has to contribute some cash towards any well they want to install. So what we see in that experiment is the effect of participation in decision-making, holding participation in financing constant. The second experiment is about contributions, asking people to contribute towards the cost of the well. And in particular, the treatment arms I'm going to talk about today is one, we have a contribution waiver. So we build the wells and communities are not required to contribute in any way towards the cost of the well. And then the second treatment arm says, for every well you want to build, you need to turn up and contribute 18 person days of unskilled labor. And that's, if you value that at the unskilled daily wage rate, that's worth about 9% of the installation costs. In every community in this study, we ran the consensus-based decision-making process that we used before. So this is the effective participation in labor, holding constant participation in decision-making. Okay. So what do? We have this kind of weird-looking, what probably the mistakes is going back through there, but we have this weird-looking data set. Okay. So we have a lot of data over time. How do we make the most of this? We use a non-parametric approach. So we take a local linear regression of a functionality dummy, so like the probability that a well is functional on time since construction. We use, I'm not even going to try and pronounce that kernel, but a fairly standard kernel, and we have a bandwidth of 1.5 years. It's not super sensitive to bandwidth. And then what we do is, because we're doing something that doesn't lend itself naturally to analytical standard errors, we run a clustered Bayesian bootstrap. So we draw weights for each community in our study, and then that allows us to draw confidence intervals around anything that we estimate using this approach. So maybe that sounds a bit like weird, but just to show you what that actually looks like in practice, this is all our data pulled together. This is time since construction. And this is the share of wells that's still functional. And again, this is pooling every single well that's in our data set. You can see that there's by 15 years out, only it's a glass half, it's really a glass half full, glass half empty situation. Like half of them are still working and half of them are no longer functional. Is that a bad thing or a good thing? I'm not sure. But then what we can do is break this down by experimental treatment arm. And you can see that over time, and we really need to hang out for a long time because it takes time for these differences to emerge. About after between 5 and 10 years, differences start to emerge between the treatment arms. You should not expect these to be in any way the same. These are run in different areas of the community, but here the dotted lines are always more participation and the solid lines are less participation. You can see that in general, the participatory approaches do better than the less participatory approaches. If we put confidence intervals around this, and sorry, I don't have this on the slide, but this is 90%, 95%, 99%. If we put confidence intervals around these differences, we can see that the difference between consensus-based decision-making and the top-down approach is statistically significant after about 10 years. There's a lot of noise still in our labor experiment. We're only about 7 years after the experiment. If you asked me to speculate wildly, you didn't, but if you did, I would say that if this was going in something in the same direction. Okay, so this is is this a big effect or not? I don't know. I don't have a good answer for you on that. If you sort of integrate this curve, it's about an additional 0.7 years of functional life over an average lifetime of 11 years to date. So that's about a 6% increase in lifetime. So it's there. It's not enormous. Let's put it that way. But we have some other evidence that makes me think that kind of supports the idea that this consensus-based decision-making approach works well. From the NGO's perspective, it's about equivalent in cost to the top-down model. You spend more time trying to coordinate these community meetings, but you don't have to do this long information gathering process. So in time cost to the communities, they're roughly equivalent. We have another study where we show that it also increases impact. So not only are there more wells that are lasting for longer, each of these wells had higher impact when we evaluated them a few years out. So that's kind of like double, like it's kind of multiplicative effect on impact. And then we don't see what the cost to the communities of these decision-making processes are. You might worry that they're high. People have to show up and have a meeting. The meetings are contentious. It's like some faculty meetings occasionally, 90 minutes of essentially arguing and then finally agreeing on something. At least I hope that you all agree on something at the end of your faculty meeting. But when we ask communities in a very structured way, about how they wanted to take decisions, communities overwhelmingly chose and were willing to give up project subsidy to take this approach to taking decisions. Okay. So I think the report card is a little bit worse for the Labour contributions. So okay, maybe if we're optimistic, there's going to be a similar pattern of effects as we go out over time. But the Labour contributions actually, I think this is counterintuitive for many people, they actually push costs up for the NGO. Because although the communities are contributing something towards the installation costs, there's a ton of overhead costs that are added for the NGO because they have to chase everyone around and make sure that they do. The coordination costs go up. And the cost of the communities go up because they have to spend time coordinating and trying to solve this problem. And so it's actually 11% more expensive on average when we think about including the cost of communities. And there we really don't see any increase in impact. So I think our report card here is split on whether this is really, the juice is worth the squeeze here. I'm inclined to sort of say consensus-based decision-making process works and Labour contributions, it's much less clear. Okay. So our takeaway is that participation can increase sustainability. There's lots more work to do on this. We have much richer data that we are still working through, so we can say a lot more about why the wells fail, what evidence we have for people actually taking care of the wells. We can also say more about water quality, and we also have data on essentially physical evidence for elite capture. So that's obviously a lower bound on elite capture, but in some cases we really see unambiguous cases of elites capturing these benefits. Someone's built a fence, put a lock on it, or in some cases they've connected it up to a pump system to their own house, and this is really no longer available for everyone else. We'll be hopefully able to update you on that in the not so distant future. And so thank you to everybody the many organizations that funded different pieces of this work over time. I guess I should flag the IGC here especially, and please reach out if you have any thoughts or you want to share.
About a minute and a half per question, so if there's any clarification.
Okay.
So just on the mechanism, you mentioned that when you have community involvement, they could choose where to put the well.
Yeah.
I wondered whether that might be a mechanism where in terms of choosing the location.
It totally could. So one of the things that they do when they choose, that's what one of the things is the story about just ownership. One of the things is that the locations differ. So one of the things that the top down that our field staff did, they lack a specific kind of information about the community. So in any community of people, there are the altruists and there are the selfish people, right? And if you belong to the community, you know who those people are. And so everyone in the community has a pretty good idea about who are the altruists and who are the selfish people. But if an outsider who comes to the community doesn't know, and ever see that people have an incentive to misrepresent themselves. So when I'm trying to find the place to put land, I might want to put it on a private piece of land because those sites are often more convenient. But when I do that, I run the risk of putting it on a selfish person's land. So that our field staff, to avoid that situation, they really try and find sites on public land. The cost of doing that is that the sites on public land are typically less convenient, less accessible. So that totally could be part of it. We haven't dived into that at all yet. That totally could be part of the mechanism.
One more question.
Is there some kind of extensive margin issue, a selection issue, in the sense that when you allow them to discuss, they might not even get to that point?
Yeah, so that's partly why we focus on these two treatment arms. So under both the treatment arms that we compare, take-up rates were almost identical. So I'm less worried in this case about, and selection is almost identical as well. So I'm less worried about the wells being sort of built in fundamentally different communities, if you want to think about it that way. This other margin of where the wells are built is definitely something we could think about. That's a selection story in some sense as well.
Great, thank you. We'll have to transition, I'm afraid. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is there's a pointer.
Okay, thank you very much to the organizers for inviting us to present this work. I'm going to be talking about the economic and environmental effects of making electricity infrastructure excludable. We've been working on this project for now, I think, 2.5 years, and we've presented this several times. This is joint with Hussain Amman at Siwani, Robin Meeks and Zhenjuan Wang at Duke, and David Yunus at American University of Sharjah. So let me talk about electricity distribution infrastructure to sort of motivate this topic of study. So we know that in many developing countries, the distribution infrastructure often consists of bare conductor wires, which are really easy to sort of tap into using illegal hooks. And this creates an excludability problem. So electricity utilities are unable to exclude customers who might not be paying and are using electricity illegally. And thus, a large fraction of electricity ends up getting lost or is never paid for at the distribution stage. Now, this, of course, has a very heavy price tag. So these sort of losses, which are referred to as non-technical losses, as opposed to sort of the natural dissipation of electricity during the distribution process. So these non-technical losses cost utilities $96 billion per year. But not only that, we know that from sort of well-established literature that when utilities have low cost recovery, they invest less in infrastructure modernization, in upgrades, and service delivery. And as a result, developing countries, the service reliability is very poor. Load shedding or outages are very common, and which have sort of negative effects on both firms and households. But what's less well known is that, is there a connection between electricity losses and the environment? In low and middle income countries, electricity generation is highly fossil fuel dependent. And of course, these are highly sort of polluting fuels, which are being used for electricity generation. Now, electricity losses might mean that we are generating more electricity, which is being sort of supplied into the system per unit, sort of purchased or recovered by the utilities, and thus leading to higher CO2 emissions. And that might happen for at least two reasons. First of all, if there's unpriced electricity, then people have less incentive to sort of conserve. It might also happen if service is unreliable, and for that reason, people are sort of less willing to invest in terms of sort of energy efficient appliances, etc. So we're going to sort of be looking at both the economic and environmental effects of an infrastructure upgrade. First, let me briefly talk about what kind of solutions utilities have been adopting to address the issue of electricity losses, specifically non-technical losses. So there are sort of non-technical solutions, but also technical solutions, which are mostly about sort of improved metering, so sort of having smart meters or prepaid meters, or improved cables. So going from the bare conductors to what are known as aerial bundled cables, which are sort of intertwined and hard to sort of tap into illegally. And they also sort of have this extra coating, which sort of makes it hard for people to just kind of connect using illegal hooks. Now, we know that these technical solutions by design should work in reducing electricity losses, but what's less clear in terms of sort of the evidence that we have is that do these solutions sort of have persistent effects? Okay, and are they efficacious, or are people finding sort of novel ways to circumvent and still sort of get back to this issue of non-excludability? Now, also, even if losses do decline, we don't have much evidence to sort of look at whether there are any effects on the environment through the channel of sort of like this excess generation or CO2 emissions that I talked about. Okay. So our research questions in this paper. So first of all, we're going to be studying a natural experiment, which was the conversion of these traditional bare conductor wires to aerial bundle cables in the city of Karachi, which is the largest city of Pakistan. It's a mega city of about 18 million people. So our research questions here are, Can these infrastructure improvements reduce non-technical losses and improve revenue recovery for the utilities? So sort of looking at the economic effects and also the effects on consumers. Do these upgrades affect consumer behavior? Do they affect consumer perceptions and beliefs about service delivery? And then finally, looking at the effects on the electricity generated and therefore the environment. So a little bit about the background and setting. So I told you that we're studying this natural experiment in Karachi. Karachi is served by Karachi Electric, which is a vertically integrated and privately owned electricity company. On average, they had transmission and distribution losses of about 20%, but that sort of like hides a lot of variation because in some of the areas of Karachi, these losses were as high as 50%. The distribution network of Karachi Electric is incredibly dense because it's serving a lot of customers over a very small area. And they have divided their network into local offices known as IBCs. There are 30 of these IBCs and 12 of those are categorized as high loss IBCs. Okay. But there are a lot of informal settlements and illegal connections, sort of very visually apparent. When you walk through these areas, you can see these sort of illegal hooks, which are commonly known as kundas. Okay, so in 2015, KE began this project of conversion of their conductors to ABCs. In 2018, it really took off in terms of the sort of, what they were doing, both on the ground in terms of scale and the speed at which they were rolling this out. They were specifically targeting these high and very high loss feeder lines. And they were adopting a ring fencing approach whereby, once the work started in a specific feeder line, they would sort of make an attempt to cover this entirely to sort of prevent negative spillovers of theft to neighboring areas, and then to sort of move outward from that location just to try to cover as many neighboring areas as possible. There were other factors which are, of course, at play because this was not an experiment and this was sort of, happening naturally over time. But, you can read the paper and check it out, but we'll talk about some of these sort of issues and what the need for identification later on. So, of course, converting to ABCs not only sort of meant that, these cables were being converted, but also that you sort of had these illegal or these kunda connections being removed. So in the second picture, you see that work being carried out. And then finally, they were sort of installing meters to meter these sort of previously informal customers. Okay. So this is sort of a cumulative graph showing coverage of ABCs over time. And you can see that in 2018, this sort of really sort of picked up pace. This is one map for one of the IBCs, which again shows how the sort of rollout proceeded. These sort of dots are what are called pole-mounted transformers. So that's what a PMT is, which I'll refer to in later slides. And the sort of highlighted dots are the ones which have been converted to ABCs. Okay, so what data we have? We're using KE's own records of feeder line level losses. These losses are defined as the difference between what's sent out in terms of units and what's billed. Okay, so the fraction of electricity which is not billed for these losses, which we look at, and also the recovery ratios, which is essentially, how much, what's the amount paid by the customers in aggregate, and how much was billed. Okay, so these are all at the feeder line level. In addition, we have other variables such as number of consumers, which helps us look at, how much formalization is happening. Consumer complaints, of course, ABC conversion rates, and in all, we're covering about 2,000 feeder lines across the city of Karachi. Okay, we supplement this with some surveys which we did in the fall of 2021. We were able to survey about 3,000 customers in some of these high loss IBCs. What we were interested in sort of really getting to was an understanding of what was consumers' experience post ABC conversion. So we asked about consumers' beliefs and perceptions about service quality and trust in the utility. Okay. And then additionally, we were able to match these customers back to KE data, looking at KE's own billing records and to sort of observe consumption and bill payment behavior of these customers. Okay. So our primary specification in this paper is a staggered difference in differences model. Okay. We're looking at this outcome Y, which can be a feeder line loss or revenue recovery measure. Okay. So I is a feeder, J is an IBC, and T is your month. The treatment variable is an indicator for whether this feeder line has converted to ABC at this point in time. And we try different sort of specifications. We have a sort of continuous measure, etc. But I'll mainly talk about this binary treatment indicator. And then we know, of course, since this was a natural experiment and not a randomized experiment, we're adding different controls, fixed effects to account for factors which have been responsible for ABC rollout. So feeder line fixed effects, which sort of take care of factors such as, what was the loss category of the feeder, what kind of community culture or sort of, other fixed unobserved factors which are there, which might have affected ABC rollout. We also add this IBC by month fixed effect, which is sort of a control for regional time varying confounders. Okay. We have a lot of identification checks to sort of establish, that the validity of the empirical strategy holds. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to sort of go over this, but I'll quickly jump to the results. You're welcome to check out the paper. The paper has the full set of these sort of identification checks. So let me talk about the results. So not surprisingly, we find that losses and revenue recovery are moving in the anticipated direction. So losses are declining. But what's interesting to note is that this effect is persistent. So we have data for up to 36 months post ABC. So we're summarizing that in the last sort of greater than the 15-month coefficient here. But if you look even up to until 36 months, these sort of losses have declined permanently, and revenue recovery has improved. How big are these effects? So this is a decline of 8.2 percentage points on a mean of 26% over the control. And so that's a pretty large effect. So that's 30% decline in losses and a smaller but yet significant decline, improvement for revenue recovery. Okay, how is this happening? Well, we see that the number of consumers is increasing, and that's entirely sort of driven by this residential increase. And so that sort of lends validity to our sort of conclusion that this is being driven through formalization of previously informal customers. When we look at consumer responses, and I'll sort of go over them quickly, we see sort of increase in bill units. So people are consuming more formally, and of course bill amounts. It's not sort of much apparent, that there's some effects on payment. So they're more likely to pay, less likely to not pay. And sort of having the likelihood of having irregular bills or sort of theft being detected in ABC lines, feeder lines is much lower. But what's interesting is that we don't sort of observe much effect on, for example, trust, so sort of considering the utility to be responsive or sort of being trustworthy. They do observe that load shedding declines, electricity shortages sort of go down. But actually, they're also more likely to say that there are more billing errors. Okay, and that's something which we are sort of looking at in a follow-up work as well. But overall, what we're finding is that improvements in service delivery in terms of at least looking at load shedding, but not sort of much difference in terms of trust in the utility. Okay. Now, implications for climate change. We know that our results are suggesting that people are consuming more, so bill units are increasing. So that might actually imply that emissions might increase because of electricity generation going up. But actually, if you look at a proxy for generation, which is electricity sent out on feeder lines, what we find is that the electricity sent out on feeder lines declines by 10% relative to the non-ABC feeder lines. Okay. And that's sort of like lending credibility to the story that these upgrades are actually leading people to sort of, because they now face the price of electricity, they have to pay for it. That's leading people to sort of be more conservative in their usage. If we translate these decreases in terms of what it means for CO2 emissions, so we can take that 10% decline in electricity sent out. We can look at the average amount which is being sort of sent out over feeder lines. We can aggregate that across all high loss feeder lines and then across over 1 year. What you find is that as a sort of percentage of KE's own emissions from generation, that number can sort of vary from 1.5% to 4.26%, depending on which fuels might sort of have been used from the cleanest to the dirtiest. Okay. All right. So our conclusion here is that The utility benefits from this ABC conversion project financially, as losses go down, recoveries improve, and the number of metered customers rises, consumers increase consumption on the grid or formal consumption, and theft declines. They report less load shedding, but no significant difference in trust in areas with ABCs. There are actually positive environmental effects of this infrastructure upgrade, as the amount of electricity which is sent out over the ABC converted lines has fallen relative to the non-ABC lines, and which thus then has positive implications for CO2 emissions. So that's it. Thank you, and I'm open for questions.
So I guess the discount had lower losses as a consequence. And then if you think, you have to assume something about what their budget constraint is. But presumably they sent at least some of those savings back out through more electricity throughout the system, maybe not just to the ABC areas.
Yeah.
That would have some impact on your field too.
So yes, that's right. So in aggregate, we're not sort of accounting for where that sort of, generation might end up, but, there could be sort of other second order effects, perhaps now that electricity can be sort of serving other needs, for example, industrial needs, etc. Right. So those are all sort of things which we're not right now accounting for. We're not able to do a full surplus calculation here in terms of, what happens when these sort of emissions are lowered, but at least what we know or what we can see is that for residential consumption, these effects are there. Yes.
I guess I worry from this that it's kind of diverting electricity away from the poor towards.
Right. So those welfare effects. So we actually have a welfare calculation in our paper. What we see is that these illegal hooks, what are called kundas, are not completely free. So when people, and it's not easy for any individual to kind of connect to even bigger conductors. So there are these what are called known as kunda mafias, which sort of provide these kundas, and so people actually have to pay some amount, although not what electricity might cost. And so the welfare effect depends on how much people are paying to the kunda mafia. And also another sort of channel of welfare effect is whether or not they were facing or how much they were rationed in terms of their electricity consumption due to, for example, load shedding happening in their area. So the different sort of channels through which these welfare effects are going to operate. And we were also concerned that what's going to be happening is it sort of taking consumption away, and which is one of the reasons I don't have one of the graphs here anymore, but we sort of separated the effects by those who live below $2 a day and those who live above $2 a day, at least for we had that data for the consumer survey, and we didn't find much differences in terms of how people actually perceived ABCs.
Sorry, we'll have to continue after the meeting.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stephanie Kestelman. I'm a fifth-year PhD student at Harvard. Thank you so much for including this paper in the program. I'm going to be talking to you about urbanization and wildfires. So 16 million houses were built in the US between 1990 and 2020 in previously undeveloped areas. That's partly due to a natural growth in housing stock, but also due to regulation limits in low-risk urban cores, which in turn push development to the urban edge. At the same time, 32% of wildfires in the US were ignited during near urban areas. Suppression costs increased from $788 million to $4.2 billion in 2020 dollars, both those numbers. And property losses also increased from about 15.5 billion to 21.9 billion. And so what is this paper going to do? It's going to ask the question, does urban growth affect the cost of these wildfires? The counterfactuals of interest are less or no additional development at the urban edge, with new housing units or new development being reallocated to low-risk areas. And then the question of the policy relevance of this question is, we're interested in the incidence of decentralized land development. As I said, I'm going to do this in California. This is a cul-de-sac after the Woolsey 2017 wildfire. You can see that half of it was burnt, but the other half wasn't. This relates to 3 main strands of the literature, but I'll just get into what I'm doing. Okay, so I'll give you a very brief production function of wildfires lesson. So how can wildfire costs be affected by development? So the way that the forestry and wildfire literature thinks about it is through 3 main cost channels, and then an additional one that we might be interested in. So first one is ignition. People start a lot of fires, and that's the spark element of this ignition function. But people might also remove fuel, either by actually doing mitigation work, but they might also increase the availability of fuel by not cleaning up vegetation, introducing invasive species, causing drier conditions around vegetation. And so the ignition part of this function is what I'm going to focus on today. And then you have wildfire size. So again, fuel might be positively or negatively affected by development. But then you have the suppression aspect of the size, which is going to be negative because people tend to try to suppress fires either to protect their homes or because they don't like negative consequences of fires. And then we might have damages to property if the fire is not contained, as well as other costs, including pollution, destruction of ecosystems, and other costs that I'm not going to talk about today. So this is the distribution of wildfire incidents in California from 2001 to 2018. And you can see that lightning, which is the only natural cause of wildfire that you have in California, is only 11% of all incidents. This pattern is replicated by wildfire size, but larger wildfires tend to be more likely caused by lightning than other ones. I'm sure some of you have heard about the gender reveal party. This is in the creation ceremony. Equipment and vehicle use will include cars, as well as like people using their lawnmowers. You can also see, hopefully you can see here, that most incidents are taking place at the urban edge. In particular, you have here in Southern California, a lot of wildfires happening at the edge of Los Angeles, and then along the San Francisco and San Joaquin valleys here in the middle. So today, just for the sake of time, I'm going to focus on the ignition externality paper, which if you look it up, I took it down because I'm still rewriting the draft, but this is my focus today. So how am I gonna do my analysis? I constructed a grid of 1 kilometer squared pixels that covers the entire state of California. And then I calculate 2 measures of development for each of those pixels. One is the share of the pixel that is developed, and that's using the National Land Cover database. And then I also have a grid of the number of housing units per pixel. I have additional pixel level characteristics. And then I have a data set of all of the wildfire incidents in California from 2001 to 2018, and they have latitude and longitude, so I'm able to map them to my data set. And then I also have suppression efforts and damages, but I don't have those today. Okay, so I follow 2 main approaches to think about the impact of development on ignition probability. The first one is a cross-sectional instrumental variables approach. So I regress the probability of incident on the share of the pixel developed. I do the same thing for housing. Today I'm going to show you the land development aspect or measure. And then for my first stage, I'm regressing share developed on the 1947 pixel distance to the 1947 freeway plan. This variable, the distance to the 47 freeway plan, comes from the Snape-Thom Snow 2007 paper. I argue that it's a plausibly exogenous source of variation, since the goal of the 1947 plan was to facilitate trade and national defense and not to encourage land development. And there's a strong first stage relationship with development, and it's not due to the overlap between where highways are located and where power lines tend to be located. The other approach that I use is a first difference approach. So if you believe that pixels have some underlying probability of fire, then the first difference will difference that out, and then it will really just get at the impact of additional development on the probability of incidence, with the identifying assumption being that the change in development is orthogonal to changes in the unobserved determinants of risk. All right, so this table has both of the approaches. You can see here that the estimates are actually quite similar. And what this translates into is about a 7% increase in wildfire probability at the average for an additional 1 percentage point of development. So here, if the pixel is 1 percentage point more developed, then fires are 0.1 or 10% more likely, 10 percentage points more likely in that particular pixel. And then this is also percentage points, and you can see here the baseline development. Now, the more interesting part of this question to me is that this is not a linear relationship. In fact, so this is plotting the long difference coefficient for different amounts of change in development. And you can see that a lot of the action is happening here at these smaller increases in development, and then it tapers off. This is also true in the cross section. You have this inverted U relationship, which suggests that it's not development period that impacts the probability of wildfire, but really, if we think back to my ignition production function, at some point the spark externality is much stronger, or in the beginning, the spark externality is stronger than the fuel reduction externality, and then it flips. I do additional things in the paper, so if I use housing units instead of using share of land developed, the results are similar but smaller because it's 1 unit of housing versus 1 percentage point development. So like 1 percentage point of 1 kilometer square developed. Development has spillovers on undeveloped neighbors. So if I only look at the pixels that were completely undeveloped in 2001 and look at the changes in development of their neighbors, there's a significant effect on wildfire probability in those pixels. I also look at the suppression side of things. So fire size decreases with development and land value, which suggests that the suppression needs increase. And then I also look at wildfire damages and find no statistically significant impact of development on damages. And I argue that that's likely because of suppression and not because of the damages themselves. Okay, so the counterfactuals are work in progress. I'll flag that again. So what I do here is I rescale the number of incidents in 2016 through 2018 by the 0.19 effect that I find earlier, assuming that either 50% of all new development between 2001 and 2016 gets reallocated, or 100%, meaning like there's no change in development. And what I find is that it's not a total erasure of wildfire incidents, partly because of the different causes, but also because people will still cause fires even at the baseline of 2001. But it's about a 6,000 incident count decrease in number of incidents. What does this mean? So the median fire burns 0.2 acres or 0.0008 square kilometers. About 55% of these small fires need suppression. And then the cost per kilometer squared suppressed near the urban edge is between $220,000 and $360,000. And so, assuming that the number of fires decreases and holding constant the median fire size, I can calculate the counterfactual savings that California would have had in suppression spending in millions of dollars. And so you can see that here the 100% reallocation would save about $600,000. And then if we are concerned, not just, I see that the damages are not statistically significantly related to development, but if we had no suppression, they might be. And so I can also calculate the average property value exposure to these wildfires. Okay, so I showed you that development increases expected wildfire costs by increasing, well, I showed you that increases wildfire probability. I told you that there is more suppression spending, and then that there's also exposed value to destruction. And the implication of this is that if the natural growth of cities goes into these undeveloped areas, then there's an argument for thinking about cities' growth. But in particular, if that growth is induced by housing supply restrictions in low-risk areas, then there is an argument for more coordinated housing supply policies, not only in California, but across the American West and in other fire-prone areas. And this is an article that came out earlier this summer about how changes in development were potentially increasing wildfire probability in San Antonio and Austin. So yeah, great, thank you.
Questions, Robert?
Different cities have different statutes on each of development. You're going to use that to see whether it's more difficult than you get fires.
So I don't do that now. I take it as a given that cities are growing in California and that most cities have a high degree of land development control. I can bring in housing supply data or elasticities of housing supply to look specifically at areas that are within the metro area of a tightly regulated versus less regulated. But California is so regulated that there's not that much variation.
Across the US, there's a lot of.
Right, but I can't get the incident level data across the US. That's why I'm doing it in California.
Just to ask the super obnoxious efficiency question, are there inefficiently too many fires? Like, are these guys not bearing the cost? Is there, like, don't they have to pay for the local fire department? Don't they have to have insurance?
Yeah.
All these kinds of things that would cause it to internalize?
It's not an obnoxious inefficiency question because I agree that that's the right question. This is my view from this paper is that there is, so bringing in this paper and then recent work by Bayless and Boomhauer on insurance. These communities are not paying the full cost of the firefighting that they are benefiting from. And so they're underspending on their protection and they're causing too many fires. And they're moving into neighborhoods without necessarily taking into account that they're potentially adding to the problem of wildfire ignition. So my thought is that yes, there is an externality here, and so there is inefficiently too many fires, and also there's inefficiently too much damage, or these people are not necessarily accounting for their damages. Did I have time for one?
Yeah, it's a good question.
I'll ask him.
Okay.
I mean, rather than just building in the center, could there be a case of making cities more efficiently shaped with, round essentially circle?
That's a good question. It's next on my to-do list with this project to think about the shape of cities. I think more so than the shape of cities, it's about cities being condensed rather than little pockets of development here and there with a lot of wildland in between. But yeah, I think that's right. Right.
Hello everyone, thank you for coming to attend this talk. So I'm a PhD student, fifth year PhD student at LSE, and this is joint work with Tim Wesley. So the motivation for this project is something which we all resound with. So achieving climate change ambitions requires a bunch of climate change actions. And one of those actions, climate actions that governments across the world could undertake would be to get rid of coal-fired power plant. But obviously, if we get rid of these power plants, we need to replace them with something that can generate equivalent amount of energy. And in our case, this is going to be solar wind. And in response to this, we do see countries in Europe and the United States responding to this phenomena. And we see that most of the coal-fired power plants in both of these, in Europe as well as in the US, are being retired, and they are being converted into gas or other alternative energy sources. But still, the coal plant, they account for roughly 30% of the annual CO2 emissions. And so if you think about coal plants, one thing which comes directly to our mind is mostly about the CO2 emissions, which creates climate change. The other one is air pollution, which is something which is more visible. And now why is this important? Is because if it's more visible, it's easier to formulate a policy on this. So it's easier to push a decisive policy action. Because if we don't observe carbon dioxide, so it might be difficult for a government to push this agenda in the legislature, but because air pollution is something which we observe, people feel, so it's much easier to push policy forward on if we anchor everything on the air pollution. So in this paper, we are going to look at the evidence on link between air quality dissatisfaction and the location of coal-fired power plants. And to do this, we are going to use the global geocoded data set on citizen attitude. So we observe the geocodes of each and every citizen that we have in the data set. And what we're going to show is that people who are living within 40 kilometers of an operational coal-fired power plant, they perceive a lower ambient air quality. And then once we have established this empirical fact, we are going to use these estimates to calibrate a willingness to pay to close down the existing coal-fired power plants for the countries which we have in the sample, as well as for all the countries across the world. And then we are going to construct a measure of benefits for replacing these coal-fired power plants with some green alternative. So in our case, it's going to be solar and wind, but we could do this for other sources also. So the main lessons, so air quality benefits itself look sufficient to justify closing down these coal-fired power and replacing them with some alternative green energy sources. Now, this is important because these benefits are only the air quality benefits. So it doesn't include any carbon reduction benefits. And this is based on significant negative effects that we observe on citizens' perception who are located near the coal-fired power plant. And there's a significant relationship between the air quality perceptions and the individual level well-being. So the key data is going to come from, so the main outcomes data is going to come from Gallup World Poll. So the Gallup World Poll is a survey which most of us might know, but it's a survey which covers roughly 99% of individuals. It's a representative of roughly 99% of adult population in the whole world. And it's conducted in roughly 150 countries. But since we need the geocode for each and every individual, we'll only be able to use around 108 countries for this analysis. Because this survey is in some of the countries like the United States and the UK, the survey is conducted through phone, so we won't be able to observe the location for those individuals. But it's kind of good in our case because we wanted this analysis to be much more representative of developing countries. And thankfully for all the developing countries, the surveys are conducted in person. So the sample that we are going to use in our main analysis is going to be highly representative of the developing country context. So based on all the restrictions that we put in our sample, we are able to use around 18,000 surveys, which represent 51 countries, mostly low and middle income countries of the world. We also have the locations of coal-fired power plants, and this is a free database which is available for anyone to download. So it has locations of around 13,000 coal-based power stations, which are located in around 108 countries. But it also contains locations of other alternative sources. So, for example, wind farms, solar farms, for nuclear power plants, we can get it from there. We use an IV strategy to show the bias in our OLS estimates. And to do this, we construct instruments. We mostly use the railroads instrument and the nearness to the water body. And there are other data sets that we use which mostly come from satellite observations or some rig analysis data sets from NASA Earth observations. and the date population of the world virgin survey. So these are the surveys which we are going to use for the main analysis. So the main analysis, when I say this, these are all the surveys which are located within 40-kilometer band of an operational coal-fired power plant. And you can see that this is mostly located in India, China, some parts of Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Indonesia, and Southeast Asian countries. So the core estimation is we are going to use an OLS in the core estimation. So on the left-hand side, we have the binary variable, which is going to take a value of 1 if an individual is dissatisfied with the ambient air quality, and it's going to be 0 if the individual is satisfied. And on the right-hand side, we construct a distance measure because we could observe the individual's distance from the nearest coal-fired power plant. So we construct this distance measure and we take a log of that. And then we control for region fixed effects and put a bunch of individual level controls, which are education, income, marital status, etc. So this is the main result. And yes, we also run this analysis for 3 separate bands. So this is going to be 0 to 40 kilometer, 40 to 80 kilometer, and then 80 to 120 kilometer. And the way through which we reach this 40-kilometer band is through doing a nonlinear analysis. So we conduct a nonlinear analysis where we see where the effects of on the perceptions go down to 0, and that gives us a number around like 30. And so we take the band from 0 to 40. So we do this regression on 3 separate bins. So the first column and the fourth column are for 0 to 40 kilometer. The first column controls for the country fixed effect, and the fourth column controls for the state fixed effects. And what we see is, so the most of the effect on the perceptions of operational coal-fired power plant is coming from individuals which are located within 40 kilometers. So the effect seems to be very, very localized. And we run some robustness checks to see whether the effects kind of change. So we do an aggregated analysis where we instead of using the geocodes for these individuals, we look at the regional level effects and we see null effect there. So that tells us the value of having a geocoded data to do this kind of analysis. Then we do a semi-parametric approach to distance and find the cutoff to be around 25 kilometers. We do some placebo tests on planned and retired plants because this database that we have on the power plants, it not only gives us the operational ones, but also the ones which have been planned in the future. So we can see whether the plants that have been planned in the future, you won't expect any effect of them to be in today. And that's what we see for the planned plant, but also for the retired plants, we don't detect any effect. So the retired plants are the ones which have been closed 2 years before. We look at the effect of water quality perception. So maybe these people are just sad and they're unhappy about everything. So we see whether the effect we see some effect on the water quality perceptions, and there are null effects. The other problem could be that most of these coal plants are co-located with other industries. So coal mines, iron and steel plants, and the coal plants. They are usually located in clusters. And what we find is that this effect is robust to this kind of interference. And then we finally look into the wind direction. Obviously, we are using only cross-sectional variation here. We have only 1 year of the data. So we look at the average wind direction for that particular year, and we find almost null effect. So there is some effect when we make the domain of influence to be highly restrictive. So if we make the distance very small and we take the angular distance to be again very, very restrictive to like 30 degrees, in those cases we find some effect of the wind direction, which goes in what we expect it to be. But overall the effects are very, very small. So then what we do is we obviously this is OLS. So obviously these plants were not brought randomly in these locations. They were constructed by governments or private entities for certain reasons, and one of these could be because of the resources or the transportation. So what we see is we look at the distance of the survey locations from the nearest railroad, and we also look at the nearest of these survey locations from the nearest body of water. And the idea is very simple. So these railroads are being used for transportation of the coal into these plants. And these water bodies could either be used for transportation, or they could be, this is just one of the intensive resources for running on these plants. And what we find is these IV effects are kind of large. They are roughly 8 to 9 times of the OLS values, which sort of suggests a positive selection. So most of the people who are very sensitive to air pollution. They tend to locate away from these coal plants, and the higher magnitude of the IV suggests something in that direction. So once we have established the empirical fact that people who are around these coal plants are not very happy, or they are more dissatisfied with the air quality, we take a life satisfaction approach to link this the well-being to the air quality. So we run an OLS, where on the left-hand side we have a measure of the utility, a proxy for utility, which takes a value from 0 to 10 on a Cantor ladder scale. And on the right-hand side, we have air quality dissatisfaction and the income levels in logs. And we use the equivalent variation to construct this measure of willingness to pay. And so this is the regression. I mean, you can see this is beta, which I showed you, this is gamma. And both of these are highly significant, and they are so basically the air quality dissatisfaction seems to impact well-being in a negative way, and similarly income increases the life satisfaction at the individual level. Now, once we have the equivalent variation, we need to get some estimate on the cost, and also we need to think about the transition process, because obviously we can't close these plants in one day. So what we do is we adopt a linear transition process over a period of 25 years, in which 4% of the capacity is converted into solar or wind every year. And we estimate this cost of this new generation technology, which is wind and solar, using the global levelized cost of energy values. Now, obviously, these global LCOE values, they don't take into account various challenges. One could be storage issues. The other could be intensive mining to construct all these batteries where the energy will be stored. So that doesn't take into account. But if we take those cost values and construct the cost benefit analysis, so what we see here, so these blue curve is the air quality benefits with the confidence bounds on 95% confidence interval bound. And this is the linear cost for wind and the solar generation. And what we can see is that basically, if even at the lower bound, the air quality benefits seems to exceed the cost that is associated with this kind of transition process. And this is over a period of 25 years in this case. So as I said, I mean, we could look at this at a very aggregate level, which I did at this point. But we could even look at this at a very fine level, which is at the power plant level. So I mean, if you think about a transition of this kind, most likely is going to happen plant by plant transition. So some plants will be closed first, then so the closure has to be scheduled plant by plant. So what we do is we look at the measure of benefits that we have for each and every plant across the world. There are roughly 3,500 plants for which is being used to develop this graph. And what we are showing here is the net benefits. So this is benefits minus the cost of conversion of these plants to solar or wind, taking the equivalent amount of generation into account. So the generation value has not been changed. Only the technology has been changed from coal to solar or wind. And what we see is for majority of these plants, the benefits are very high. The net benefits are positive; they are very high. But for some of them, we do see some losses here, which are but these are not obviously majority; they're very small in number. And then to add to the main debate about carbon benefits, so one of the problems in this analysis could be, so all the plants that are existing right now, they might be in locations which are dense, but governments could internalize this problem, and they might locate the future plants in areas which are not dense, and therefore people won't be dissatisfied. So what we do, so for that, I think it's very important to add in the carbon benefits here, because irrespective of where the plants are, the carbon cost will always exist if there is emission. So what we do, we take a very conservative approach towards carbon benefits. So we take the lower bound on the carbon social cost of carbon estimate, which is roughly $20 per ton of CO2 emitted. I mean, the costs are obviously in the order of 100, but even if we take $20 of CO2, we can see that the benefits shoots up to almost like double of the air quality benefits, and that's basically something which takes into account the carbon benefits of this kind of transition also. So the key takeaway is we found some robust evidence that there is perceived cost to coal-fired power, and the willingness to pay calculation suggests that the phasing of coal-fired power is justified. One of the reasons why this policy is kind of important is because it's based on something which is more visible to the citizens. But why is there not more action? Maybe it's not a serious political issue. So in 1960 United States, when Clean Air Act was not there, US air quality was not good. But perhaps this evidence that we are providing here for these developing countries might help shape the narrative and might lead to some action on this front. Thank you.
One burning question. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Alan's on the left.
People don't like coal plants, but maybe they also don't like windmills and wood plants, and so that's one thing to think about. Point two is that Ito and Zhang have this nice paper in the GTE on air filters in China. They show how a slightly more sophisticated demand system can allow you to be more precise on welfare calculations, including leaning into distributional effects. And I wonder if you can take some.
Yes, so just a small point. So we did look at that. So I think this is mostly on the PM 2.5, the use of PM 2.5. So we are in a process of replicating those to see whether the estimate that we are obtaining is kind of similar there. But we did our replication using, for one of the studies that was done using contingent valuation methods, and we found the estimates to be more or less similar. But yeah, that's what. Thank you.
I'll have to take the break. I'm sorry. Great, thanks. Our final presentation for this session. You can do that, and I'll show you the task.
Hi everyone, thank you for attending. My name is Omry Yoresh. I'm first year PhD student here at the LSE. I wrote this paper with Victoria Delbridge from Hebrew U and Jenny Amachkovsky from Northwestern University. Our paper's name is Heads Up, Does Air Pollution Cause Workplace Accidents? So let's get started. So just to give some background and motivation, we all know how serious workplace accidents can be. And specifically, construction accidents are each year occur 26.5 million construction accidents in the world, with over 350,000 deaths each year. This also takes a toll on the economy. If we look at the US alone, a ministry report over there estimated the loss from productivity, both in wages and productivity itself, to $44.8 billion just in 2020. And our main motivation to ask the question regarding the construction accidents come from literature on pollution itself and the effects it leads to individuals. If it's shortness of breath and coughing that we know about and the common also know about, but it also creates impaired motor function if we're talking about transitory pollution, lack of concentration, impatience, and many more. And these have also been shown to be have an effect on a day-to-day life and economic research. If we're talking about testing in students, it has an effect on that. It has an effect on productivity, labor supply, and many much more. So this is our main motivation and the background that motivated our question. So in this paper, we study the effect of NO2, nitrogen dioxide, which is a primary pollutant, very variable in both in space and time, on construction injuries and fatalities in Israel. So we got data both from the Ministry of Labor in Israel of all active construction sites between the period of 2017 and 2019, of every day they were active, and all the accidents that occurred in that time span, which amounts to over 1,000 accidents in total. And accommodating this data, we got also from the Ministry of Health, we got a detailed pollution level of 173 monitors all across Israel, which is pretty dense. And we got specific details matched for the pollution data, also wind strength, direction, humidity, temperature, and all in like 8 hours interval, very detailed. And we matched that to each site. We matched that to each site at no more than 1 kilometer distance from each site active in our data. So in this presentation, I'm going to touch on our benchmark identification. Our benchmark identification is a construction site fixed effect model. We have a fixed effect for each site in our data. that includes both weather variables, which I touched about, humidity, wind, and temperature, and also time controls, if it's week of the day of the week, which is important, month, year, etc. Later on, I'll show that using instrumental variable analysis, we have two IVs analysis and a use of a random variation in wind direction daily. We verify there's actually no bias in our benchmark identification. If you're concerned with on-site co-determination of pollution and probability of accident, I'll touch on that as well. And it's also robust to the inclusion of other pollutants. We see that NO2 is pretty robust with other pollutions as well. NO2 is the it has the most unit observations in our data set, allowing us for more variation, but it's still stronger than others compared to NO2. And I'll touch also in mechanisms. We show that fatigue and cognitive load, we proxy that by several stuff. We show that it worsened the pollutants effect. So just touching on our research design, on our left-hand side, we got binary variables for accident. One, if an accident occurred in site in a certain day, in site S on day T. And on our right-hand side, we have a linear measurement of NO2 in the closest monitor to the site on a given day. For this analysis, we use the measurement between 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., which corresponds with the workday. We also add a linear measurement to temperature, wind, and humidity, also squared. We insert, and the time fixed effect, year, month, day, and construction site fixed effect, allowing us to compare within site. So if just the raw correlation in column 1, we can see that NO2 has a very strong connection to the accident. Just for the coefficients here are multiplied just so you can understand, but the baseline, one standard deviation increase is calculated through the actual coefficient, which is here times by 1,000, just for the ease of reading. And when adding the controls, you can see that this coefficient translates to when one standard deviation increases the probability for an accident in a given site by 46% in our baseline measure. But this is not the whole story that we wanted to see. We also wanted to see where this is originating from in terms of the distribution of pollution every day. We ran the same benchmark analysis on a semi-parametric estimation, including all of these controls that I mentioned before. We can see here, I marked the clean, moderate, and unhealthy levels that the EPA has on NO2. That corresponds with the 95th percentile, the moderate level, and the 99th percentile as unhealthy. We can see that the effect is really nonlinear, and we can see that in really critical levels, the amount goes up to more than 300% increase in the probability of accidents on very, very polluted days. So one could be concerned with the on-site pollution. It may be co-determined by heavy machinery, days with high risk of for a probability of accidents, and might lead to just to a positive correlation without any causal claim. We address this concern with what I said, a random variation in wind direction. Each day we have this measurement, and two IVs. One is just instrumenting pollution further away from the construction site, and the other pollution the night before when the site is mainly inactive. So just illustrating what I'm meaning, if in our baseline measurement we have this construction site, in our benchmark analysis, we take the reading of the closest monitor right here. But when considering the wind direction, if it's coming from southeast right here, we would not want to take this monitor as it's more likely to pick up pollution generating from the construction site itself. We would take still within 1 kilometer radius because what our data allows it. We take the one that is 100 is against the wind direction, we'll take this monitor. And the IV regarding the distance, we take the average of the four, in this case, four pollution monitors that are between the 5-kilometer ring, the blue one, and the 10-kilometer ring. We take the average reading of NO2 in all of these four monitors. And of course, I can't show you here, but we take also the IV of the night before. So compared to our OLS right here in column 1, we can see that the wind direction is relatively similar in size. We can see the coefficient right here, and the 2SLS as well, with a strong F statistics for our IVs. We can see the effect of 1 standard deviation increase on the probability of accident, ranging from 46% to 45%, which is pretty strong and invalidates our findings from the benchmark analysis. Continuing with the mechanism, another contribution that we're interested in showing is identifying the mechanisms. As our motivating question is that the effect of pollution, the channel through which it affects, is the psychological state of the worker. If fatigue, if awareness, other stuff like that, we proxy it in our measurement by two environmental measurements that we have. If it's strong wind or strong temperature, which also increases strain and cognitive load, more risk for accidents for the workers on site. And also the start of the week, which is Sundays in Israel, which comes also with weekend fatigue. There's a study showing it that it's more likely that people are less aware of their surroundings and less aware of other stuff that might cause it. And when we actually check for this evidence, when I split the sample of wind above 75th percentile of wind and under, we can see that the effect's almost 3 times as high for very windy days and almost twice as much for temperature for very hot days, compared to the lower temperature days, which is under 75th percentile. When considering the day of the week element, the start of the week, the middle level here is the interaction of Sunday, the first day of the week, with the measurement of the linear NO2, and comparing that to the interaction levels of Monday, Tuesday, and other days of the week, we can see that the effect of NO2 itself is lower rather than the Sunday, the interaction with Sunday. So concluding everything, we do find that NO2, nitrogen dioxide, increases the probability of construction accidents and likely to also, if not end in an accident, lower the productivity. The effect is very large and also very nonlinear, originating from it's concentrated in the very high levels of pollution. We do see that fatigue and high cognitive loads, as we shown in the proxies of the start of the week and wind and humidity, do worsen this effect. And also in our paper, but it's not in the scope of this presentation, we also propose relevant solutions to this problem and try to quantify them with a cost-benefit analysis and other stuff that we have planned. If it's for interventions, we're in talk with the Ministry of Labor in Israel, and yeah, that's it.
I think it would be great to know if the firm would know the level of pollution at that day. Would they still let their workers work? Would that be efficient for them or not? And the other thing from the worker side as well.
Yeah, so we actually presented it to contractors in Israel, and they were not, it seems like they are not aware but are willing to take actions. I know in the UK they started giving on-site measurement, like sensors for pollution. I don't know if they're using it for this reason, but I know that they have on-site pollution sensors. So I think contractors would, of course, would decrease the level of probability of accident and also might not be yeah. I think it's a good thing, and we saw that contractors are willing to, but are not aware.
Okay, we have a luxurious almost 1 hour for coffee. So thank you to all the presenters for this session, and please come back at 3:45 for the MAP Director of Urbanization, followed usually by a whole on urbanization.
Preparing today's session, primarily during the policy panel. So yeah, I just want to say sort of a brief few words about the session on urbanization and climate change, because as head of Cities that Work, I'm super excited that we're having a session on urbanization this year, because I do think it's one of the sort of most pressing challenges and sometimes a bit of an overlooked opportunity when it comes to adapting to and mitigating climate change, particularly in developing countries. And I think, you know, just in terms of framing, cities are both a place of vulnerability, but also a place of refuge from climate shocks. And in particular, they're also the place where sort of future growth and development of countries will occur. So to teach us a little bit more about this, we are privileged to be joined today by Gharad Bryan, Associate Professor of Economics at LSE, one of the IGC's most formidable research program directors, and only no giggles, an associate of the Stockholm Economic Organization and Public Policy Program as well. So Gharad will be leading the masterclass, but before we let him do that, I'm going to also introduce our policy panel, where we will hear from our two esteemed guests. So Dr. Mervat Al-Mhairat, Deputy City Manager for Health and Agriculture in the Greater Amman Municipality in Jordan. Dr. Mervat has been in the public sector in Jordan for over 22 years with 14 years of experience at the Greater Amman Municipality, including a lot of work that links to climate resilience. We've also got Dr. Omar Masud, CEO of the Urban Unit in Pakistan, a policy think tank within the government, working to support in making and implementing urban policy across all levels of government. He's also been in the Pakistan civil service for over 15 years, including previous roles as the Additional Secretary of Finance in the province of Punjab. So a really warm welcome to both of you for joining us today. And I think also just highlighting the connection between policymakers and researchers, which is really at the core of what we do and aim to do at IGC. So we're really honored to have you both here with us. Really excited about the format of this discussion, to share about sort of your priorities and how research can be helpful in particular. Some of the big picture questions we'll cover in today's session will be around, should migration be encouraged as an adaptation strategy? How can we do this? What are the challenges? How can municipalities better support adaptation in cities? How can a focus on reducing harmful local externalities such as air and water pollution contribute to the mitigation of emissions as well? And what types of successful environmental initiatives have been implemented in cities and can they be replicated? And finally, if any of you were around last year in our webinar that we held on urbanization and climate change, Dr. Masud said something quite profound, which got us in our tracks. Said if we don't have the resources, it's all just storytelling. So I think an important thing we'll need to pick up on is how do we actually fund the focus as well. The only bit of housekeeping I'll say is that we do have a designated time to ask questions at the end of the session, so please do note them down as we talk through the various points and keep them for then. Although apparently Gary can be interrupted at any moment. Perfect. Without further ado, it's over to Professor Bryan to lead with the masterclass.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Vicky. And thanks for everyone for coming along. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sustainable urbanization. I'm going to talk absolutely from an academic's perspective, and then we're going to get a policymaker's perspective, and maybe the two come together in a wonderful way. Okay, so it's hard to pay attention for an entire talk, so I thought I'd tell you everything I'm going to say at the beginning, and then you can relax for the rest of it. So first of all, we will have urbanization in developing countries. It's coming, it's going to be large, and it's going to be more than historically because there's likely to be a lot of climate migration. That is, people who are displaced from more rural areas. And we know historically when people are displaced, they tend to move to cities. So we're going to have a lot of urbanization. There have been attempts in the past to slow urbanization, but I'm not really aware of any that have been very successful. China is most famous, and it obviously does a little bit to try and slow urbanization, but it obviously hasn't stopped urbanization. There are lots of externalities associated with living densely with other people, as you do in cities. And some of these externalities are positive externalities, and some of them are negative externalities. That means that when you bring a whole heap of people into a city together, as is going to happen, that could be good, and that could be bad. And it is completely a policy choice which of these outcomes we have, the good outcome or the bad. Now, we know theoretically what are appropriate policies. We need to address the externalities that are associated with density. We need to tax the negative externalities, and we need to subsidize the positive externalities. That much is straightforward. But what we really don't know, particularly in the developing world, is empirically exactly what do those policies look like. And we need to know that on a location by location, city by city kind of resolution. That means we need three things, and this is going to be my main argument to you. We need brave policymakers who engage in experimentation around potentially efficient policies. That's not my area. I'm not brave enough to make those choices. I'd rather look at the data afterwards in the comfort of my office. But we do need also early collaboration between those brave policymakers and academics to try to gather the data, to try to understand what those policies do, to throw away the ones that don't work and to keep the ones that do. And I'm going to try to highlight, mostly from my own work, the value of bespoke on-the-ground data collection. Of course, there's more data coming, and there's big data, and there's satellites, and there are cell phones and all these kinds of things, but I'm going to try to push the typical development economist answer, which is you need to be on the ground collecting the data that is appropriate to the question that you are asking. This perhaps is a slow response, and it's the academics' response. If we want sustainable cities, we have to try things, we have to see what works. We need to do it in a trial by error kind of way. So that's what I'm going to say. So first of all, urbanization is coming. I'm just going to use Africa as an example. These are the United Nations predictions of the urban population of Africa. These were done in 2018, although I don't suppose they're terribly different now. Currently, there are around 500 million to 600 million people living in urban areas in Africa, and there'll be 1.5 billion by 2050. That is 1 billion more people living in cities. Why? We know there's a strong growth urbanization correlation. As countries grow, they urbanize. As countries urbanize, they grow. It could go either way, but they're going to go hand in hand, or at least they have always done so before. And the second is, I believe there will be increasing amounts of climate migration, and I believe that will be into cities. Historically, people tried to take refuge in cities. Now, as I said earlier, there are two possible outcomes. I'm going to start with the best outcome. The glass is half full. So when we come together in a city, this density that we create has positive externalities, and these lead to the pros of urbanization. First of all, and I'm going to lead with the sustainable things here, it's potentially the case that people who are gathered together into a city are better protected from climate change. It is obvious that a dense community is in some ways easier to protect. We have for centuries taken refuge in citadels and castles where we bring our population out of rural areas, we shove them in a tower, and we build a wall around them. And so in principle, that is possible. Cities can also be anywhere. They are created because we spread ideas when we come together, and they are not reliant to as great an extent as other sectors and areas on the place that they sit. So I can have a city in an area that's on high ground and in a cooler place, and that doesn't necessarily affect its productivity, whereas it does for others. So cities could be better protected. They could also be relatively pollution-free because of the externalities of living close together. So the fact that you decide to come and live near me in a dense urban environment means I don't need a car to visit you. I can walk to your house, and once I'm walking rather than driving, I'm polluting less. Your air conditioning, if we live in a dense city block, cools my home as well as your home, and we can more efficiently cool dense buildings. And there are many other examples. Finally, the classic reason we get cities is because they are more productive. So when we come together, the ideas that you talk to me about at the cafe when we bump into each other become my next multi-million-dollar adventure. Your large labor pool in the city means that we get better matching of laborers to particular jobs. And these are the classic things. And I think it's very reasonable to think that if you have urbanization in response to climate change, you get actually three really great outcomes. You get mitigation, adaptation, but you also get development at the same time. So that could be great. On the other hand, density creates negative externalities, and this is why cities are controversial and why migration and density is controversial. So these are the cons. Let's start with the classic. If we all live in cities, they potentially become congested. If you decide to drive your car into the LSE, and your car use slows me down as I try to use the densely packed roads. This then means our city is less dense, which means we get less of this positive, productive benefit, and we're also cranky at each other. So that's bad. The second is, it's potentially the case that cities are more climate vulnerable. For example, or parts of them, informal housing often sits on neglected parts of urban areas. Those are often floodplains, and as a consequence, they are quite climate vulnerable. But the externalities associated with living in formal housing make it very hard to move informal housing. We live together, we form social bonds, we share job ideas, we share ideas. This makes it hard for me to move individually away from my informal housing. So potentially cities create very dense, climate vulnerable populations. It's plausible that cities actually increase carbon emissions. So when we all get densely together, we get the urban something or other effect. What is it? Urban heat island effect. That means we need more air conditioning to stay cool. Equally, idling cars, and you can see my great love of cars in this presentation, are worse for air pollution. So if we have congested cities, we have more air pollution and we have more pollution. Finally, and I think worst case scenario here, is that cities that are poorly managed can be areas of conflict. And you just have to think about what will happen if you have a very large number of climate migrants arriving in cities all at once, and it is just the most common outcome of a disaster film. Everyone tries to cross the bridge at the same time, and chaos happens. So those are the good and the bad. And economists have known for a very long time that you can only solve these problems of externalities through some kind of collective action, and collective action is policy. We can solve these problems, we can get the good without the bad, but we have to come together and make good choices to do. So how do we get those good choices? Well, first of all, we face a very big challenge in the developing world. Here I'm going to lean on some work by Remy Jedwab and Dietrich Vorath. Ed Glaser has also written about this. What is this? This is the urbanization rate divided by GDP, and this is the entire world, and this is the date. And as you can see, we've been getting more and more and more urbanized at lower and lower and lower levels of GDP. What's driving this, to some extent, is absolutely massive cities in quite poor countries. That means that we are going to have to try to get the negatives away and lean into the positives. But we're going to have to do that with fewer government resources than it's been done with before, lower government incomes, I think likely lower state capacity in the governments that are dealing with these issues, etc. So that's a big challenge. Now, in principle, economic theory tells us the answer to this challenge. If we want to use our resources, our state resources efficiently, we do only those things that the market will not do. Okay, so we've got externalities, we do only those things that the market will. This helps us to leverage private resources to achieve state aims. And in principle, if we understand, for example, the climate migration problem, we can understand where the externalities are, and in theory, we can understand where we want to take action. So, for example, when people move out of rural areas, out migration, there are people left behind, and there's going to be an externality on their ability to live good lives. In migration affects host communities. There's an externality. When I move into a city, I don't think necessarily about the impact of my moving in on the community that will host me. Informal housing, as we talked about before, is often misallocated, but because it's very hard to purchase a whole heap of little informal houses, it's hard to bring them together and build more dense high-rise buildings. All of these are examples of externalities and places where we would potentially need policy implementation. Now, the theory here, I think, is extraordinarily useful, and I don't want to downplay it. I think it's often very useful in an urban setting to ask, what is the least cost action that we can take in order to create a market? So what does the government's minimum thing that they can do to crowd in some kind of private response? And this is the #1 question we get asked at the IGC, I believe, which is how do we get waste markets to work? In principle, there's value in waste, but it is hard to get that value as a private organization. Some of that is potentially because it's not sorted at the point of use. So can mandating waste separation by a government create a market for waste? You see how I see the externality. When I don't sort my waste, then the company has to pay for it, and that means the market doesn't work. Is there a very simple way of doing this? The other I won't talk about. So in principle, we know the theoretical answer, but when you read this question, it should be obvious that we don't know the empirical answer to this question. So we need to have someone, a brave policymaker, go out and try some policies that might help with waste separation and try to understand whether that is enough to get a waste market. So to get empirical answers, we're going to need that policy experimentation. That's not my part of it, I'm afraid. But then I'm going to argue we also need some early collaboration between those policymakers and academics. And we're going to need, I think, bespoke data collection. And I'm going to try to illustrate these 2 points with examples from my own work, not because it's good, but because I know it well. Okay. The first example is a project that's currently titled Evicted in Ethiopia. And this is joint work with Simon Franklin, who is not in the audience, the wonderful graduate student, Sarah Winton, who is sitting just here. Okay, so what's the issue? As I've said a little bit so far, informal housing has negatives and positives. So what are the negatives of informal housing? Well, it can tend to be vulnerable to climate change. It's in areas that may be vulnerable. And infrastructure to combat that is often extremely hard to supply. That's just the externality. If I live alone, it's easy to build a drain next to my home, but once you come and live next to me, it becomes extraordinarily hard. Also, the land may be misallocated. Very low informal houses are not necessarily very dense, and plausibly building up is a better use of that space. And we know that developing country cities have low heights. Okay, so those are the negatives of informal housing, and there are many more. There are also positives of informal housing, and we know that because people continue to live in informal housing. It's close to jobs, often, and it has these dense social networks that are hard to recreate. Now, because of this, people don't tend to leave their informal houses, and so one policy thing that's been very popular in the past is essentially forced slum clearance. I tell you that you are evicted, and I give you some kind of compensation for that. Now, the key question here is, how bad is this, I think? So we think it probably alleviates this, but how bad is it for the people who are living there? And in particular, what do you need to do to go about compensating? And I think it's probably the case that we really know no facts about this at a sort of level where a current economist would believe we have good causal evidence on what happens when you evict people. So Sarah and Simon and I have been studying this with a large-scale evictions program in Addis Ababa. So, first of all, early collaboration. Because Simon has been working with the World Bank in Addis, evaluating lots of programs, we have an amazing baseline data set that was collected prior to the eviction program being announced. And importantly, it is a large sample and it is geolocated. This is Addis, or at least some of Addis. And everything here is an area where you had some evictions, and everything on the white areas are areas where you do not. Using these geolocations, the obvious thing for us to do is to go back and get this sample of people who are right next to a border. We probably think they're rather similar to each other, particularly on the boundary. And then because we have access to that data set, because of collaboration prior to the program, we can go and do that. Then I can create this picture. This is the distance from the completed boundary of an eviction project, and this is whether or not you were evicted. And you can see that those who are not on the treatment side were not evicted, and those who were on the treatment side were evicted. Because we have a baseline, we can check whether we do have a discontinuity prior to the program, and we do not. Okay, so now we have this nice ability to try to work out what this program did. If we see a jump, say in household earnings or in household consumption, then we will think there's a positive impact of the program and vice versa. So what does it do if you collect this data? What do we find? Well, the first thing I think you find is it might not be as bad as you think to evict people. Yeah.
Sorry, you said we could jump in.
Yeah.
What about tracking? Because I guess it's much harder to find the people who got kicked out than the.
I'm not going to do it now. This is what I would call hot off the press and an example of what you might achieve if you did this stuff. But Sarah will know, I don't think it's terrible.
Awesome.
Is my answer to that at this
You're going to 90% at the end line of term treated for evicted households.
Wow, awesome.
So, earnings per household member go up after eviction. This is somewhat surprising if you thought that labour market connections were really important for having jobs. So that seems really positive. Expenditure at the household level also goes up, and you might think that that's quite positive. But then, because we have nice data, you start to see some of the negatives. Where's the expenditure going? Increased transportation costs and increased rents. No increases in food consumption and no increases in other expenditure. But overall, you still might think this is on net a zero. So we've cleared a slum area, we can build nice new buildings on it, and we haven't done particularly much damage. But because we are able to go and ask the questions that target the particular externality that we're interested in, which is social networks, we can get a better understanding of whether these are all positives or whether these are negatives. This is just a sample of the data that we have. This is one that I think is the best, which is just how satisfied are you with the interactions that you have with your neighbors. And we see a very large negative impact on these. But your neighbors find less. I don't know what to do with that. But this is just an example of the fact that if you want to study a particular externality and know whether a particular program does what you want, then I think you're going to need to gather your own data. This data rarely exists in a census data set at a geocoded location, let alone being able to find it from cell phone. Okay. So it's, yep.
How much do you know on the compensation these people were given?
So that's why there are sort of 4 columns here. This is the averages. These guys owned a private home beforehand and they were given some cash and maybe some access to land that's quite a long way outside Addis. These guys were renting privately. They weren't given public housing by and large, but they were given a little bit of cash in response to this. And these guys were in government housing at the baseline, and they are predominantly in government housing at the end line, and they get that sort of help. And so these differences are our attempt to try to answer your question of whether the compensation matters and what exactly it is. And the answer to this question is it doesn't appear to, but we have a very small sample in this group. Okay. So overall, what am I trying to say here? Well, forced evictions, we need to know what something like this does if we want to contact informal housing and if we want to move people out of areas that might be climate vulnerable. It seems we find incomes increase, but so do rents and networks worsen. We're working on trying to add these up and thinking about what the total policy does. Second, and leaning into my love of alliteration, I'm calling this project Inclusive Infrastructure. This is with Claire, who's sitting here, and no one else. Okay, so the issue here is infrastructure is often local. So if I'm going to build some infrastructure to overcome an externality problem in my city, I'm going to build it near someone's homes. So for example, if I build public transport, it's going to be useful to the people who live near that piece of public transport. But that means it's easy to take that public good away from the people it's targeted at. So I build transport, rates increase, and the poor or the people who really need it move away. And so then I'm trying to improve the lives of the people who are moving into my city, but I can't necessarily target the people that I want to target. To understand whether this occurs, we're trying to evaluate the bus rapid transit system built recently in Dar es Salaam. This is DART, Dar es Salaam Bus Rapid Transit System. And again, I'm just going to make the same 2 points again, which is the importance of early collaboration. So through the World Bank, we were able to collect a geocoded baseline data set. This is Dar es Salaam. We have data in all of these points and ex-ante travel lines before the building of the program. This means we can use a differences in differences strategy to try and work out what the program did. And in principle, what we're doing is we're seeing whether more affected locations saw greater change than other locations. We wouldn't be able to do this if we didn't have a geolocated data set from prior to the intervention. There are no others available in Dar es Salaam. So you need to have this knowledge that it's about to be built. You need to be able to collect the data. We also do something cool. Melanie created these lovely pictures here, which is normally you get data at a location level. So I would know whether an area that had the Jubilee line built next to it saw an increase in incomes and rents. But that's just a fact about the location. It is not a fact about the people who were there, who I tried to give the infrastructure to. So what do? We have 3 kinds of households. This is a house that was there at baseline and stayed there till the end line. This is a house that was there at the baseline and they left and were replaced by another household. This household that arrives, we ask them retrospective data about their lives before they move to where they are. And this person who moves, we track them and we find out what happened to their lives. And this is going to allow us to answer our question empirically, which we can't with regular data sets. Yeah.
So how do you want us to think about time frame of adjustment costs? Because both in your previous project and here, I hear what you're saying, but even like the life satisfaction or here moving, I can imagine there's an immediate aftermath.
Yep.
And then there's a kind of medium term and long term. So what do you want us?
I think the answer to this question is that the short run is often just as important as the long run, and typically we can only answer the long run. So if I have a census that's every 10 years, I'm going to get 10 years later.
But these data, are they short? You want us to think of them as short?
Oh, these are definitely short run because this is work in progress. If everything works out well, we can hopefully go back and answer the long run question. But at the moment, these are recently implemented policies. And if you think a little bit about it, if we do things that are different, we probably want to try and track in the short run and keep going into the long run. But I take the point totally. We'd like to know the long run. There's definitely adjustment costs on the way through. Okay. This allows us, this data structure, which you just can't see otherwise, allows us to the following. We can ask whether the arrivers are different from the people who were there beforehand. We can ask what happens to the exiters. And we can ask, because well, the second thing is, we also collect data that's both about men and women, and you'd be surprised how hard it is to see this in census data often. And so we can ask whether women benefit from the trends. And this is a rough statement of the benefits that we see of this data, not the outcomes of the project. So these are at the structure level. This is usually what you look at, just at the location. And we see very strong positive impacts on female labor force participation. This also leads to higher incomes and things that I'm not going to show you. But this is the negative effect that we're worried about. We also see reasonably strong impacts on rent. So that raises the possibility that what's going on here is that this infrastructure has been taken by somebody else who is wealthier and more able to use it. We can then look at the baseline outcomes of arrivers, those who moved into BRT affected locations, relative to exiters, and see whether there's evidence of selection. And the answer here is there appears to be yes. Those who moved into the BRT affected locations are much more likely, 10 percentage points more likely to have been commuters at the baseline. So that raises the possibility that a lot of this effect is just due to people moving in. Finally, we can see that that is not the entirety of the effect. There is a causal effect on the people who were there. At the beginning, this is the impact of the BRT on those people who were living there before the BRT was built. And we still see the strong positive impact on female labor force participation, but it is slightly less positive. So overall, we're trying to work out whether the DART is inclusive. I think it is an important policy question. And we kind of find some increases in female labor force participation, but it increases rents, some evidence of selection. And as with the last project, this is work in progress and there'll be more to come on reconciliation. But the point I mostly want to make here is that for both the DART and for the project in Addis, we needed to have early collaboration, knowledge that the program was going to be implemented to start collecting data, and we needed to collect bespoke data to answer our questions. And so the push here is really around the sorts of things the IGC likes to see, which is collaboration prior to policy implementation. And I think both of these are interesting examples. Yeah, John.
You say like increase of rent like it's always a bad thing, but isn't the increase of rent because the amenities are better? So if the rent just affects it's better.
Sorry if that's the impression I gave. And this could entirely be that the people who are there just love living there. There's some competition, they manage to stay there and they continue to get the benefits of it. And they increase their productivity, and that could be it. It's really this that's telling me that there is some element of selection going on here. We have other variables here. For example, those moving in are much more educated than those who were there to start with. And that to me is very strongly suggestive that this rent effect is to some extent causing this churn that we're concerned about. But yeah, I don't want to say that the rent is inherently negative. It could be.
Does everybody rent, or do some people own their own places? They move out and sell them. They get that benefit in terms of.
Yeah, so a small number of people here own their own homes. Yeah, and I'm deliberately just being very vague about this, and the paper will, when I write it, and Claire writes it, do more of this. Okay, so summary: urbanisation is coming. Externalities mean that this could be good or could be bad. It could be sustainable urbanisation, or could be unsustainable urbanisation. In principle, we know what to do, and I think economic theory gives us very clear answers. We need to find the externalities and we need to respond to them. But in practice, we need to do that in the most efficient way possible, and that means just gathering data. And I want to highlight three things that we need. We need policy experimentation. We need people who are willing to try new things in their locations. And then we need early collaboration between those policymakers and academics to try to collect data to evaluate what happens and hopefully find a set of policies. Thank you very much.
So we are transitioning straight into the policy.
So we'll have two presentations by the policymakers who have joined us today. If those of you who are staying, if you could take your seats, or if you are going to leave, we need to sort of start with the policy session now. So I think a big thank you to Gharad, particularly for outlining, I think, the protection of the agency model in really relative to early collaboration and start collecting data in advance and experimentation of policies. So maybe we can have that framing in the back of our heads as we go into this policy discussion. But for now, it's over to the policymakers to help us in actually identifying what these externalities might be and what sort of priorities we need to be focusing on. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Al-Mhairat up first to give her presentation, and that'll be followed by the presentation by Dr. Masud.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to express with our policymaker in Jordan. Anybody visit Amman, Jordan? This will save me a lot of time. Of course, you all know that all types of cities need whatever plan or policy or climate change, whatever the size, if it's large metro-secondary cities or towns. Amman, Amman it has been faced a lot of migration from other cities because of the crisis such as Syrian refugees, Yemenis, Baghdad, and all over neighborhood cities has been suffering from the war. The number of citizens in Amman has been duplicated. It was in 2014. It was 2.5 million. Now it's 4.9 million. So this crowd is cause and pressure on the infrastructure. Amman is a large metropolitan city are facing a challenge of urbanization due to the climate change. Amman is one of such a city where urbanization is a continuous challenge due to the sudden rise in population in about 10 years, as I told you. This is due to the combination factor include refugees, one of the factors, neighborhood countries, internal immigration. Amman is the center of the city, the economics and the business is in Amman. All other cities in Jordan, there is no development or there's no opportunity to work. So everybody come to Amman to work there. And economic opportunities, an economic opportunity to have a business in Amman. The rapid urbanization of Amman has put a lot of pressure on the city infrastructure and natural resources. Most the natural resources, so the infrastructures has been suffered, especially the public transport. The infrastructure is suffered from utilization from the large
of migration. And this is city of Amman, some picture of city of Amman. It's a lovely city. Please, everybody come to see it. Should migration cities can be encouraged as an adaptation strategy? How, what, and what are the challenges? Of course, migration as an adaptation strategy to climate change. Migration is a complex phenomenon that can be driven by a variety of factors, including climate change. When people migrate to city in search of opportunities for work, it can be seen as an adaptation strategy to climate change. Access to new opportunities such as jobs, a lot of jobs there in Amman. Other cities know there's no jobs. There's a lot of jobs, but not like in Amman. Education, most, let's say, cities, most big universities are in Amman, private or public sector. And healthcare, it's more well developed in Amman. Increase resilience, climate shock and stress, reduce poverty and inequality. Challenge of migration. Putting a strain on cities such as overcrowded, homeless, and lack of access to basic services, social tension and conflict, loss of cultural identity. Maybe this is not in Amman. Complex and depends on a number of factors such as the specific circumstances of city, the needs of migration and potential impact on the city infrastructure and services. And this is what we are suffering now in Amman. Recommendation for the encouraging migration, develop policies that make it easier for migrate to access job and education and healthcare. And I think the policymakers in Amman are working now on this to make a greater open opportunity for jobs and healthcare. Invest in infrastructure services, accommodate a growing population, promote social inclusion and integration of migration into the city, and support research on the impact of migration in the city. And this is, I think, we need more encourage on, because we lack a lot of research on migration in the city of Amman. Because I'm asking about the methodology in this research, which has been published, because we will gain knowledge from it. How can municipalities better support adaptation in cities? Of course, municipalities support adaptation in cities by plan for the future and invest in the infrastructure and regulate development. Of course, municipality can better support adaptation in cities by taking a number of steps. Offer incentives for business or for the economics to open more and more business so we can create more jobs. Raise awareness in climate change and how to save and save the utilization of the resources. Amman is lack of water with high temperature, so lack of water to drink, and there's no a lot of green spaces in Amman. Working all together, private, public, NGOs, citizens, all together to implement that. So, municipality support for adaptation, of course, there's a different strategies has been adapted by Amman. It has been adapted and developed a strategy 2022 to 2026. It has been issued in front of the Jordan, and we are committed to finalize this strategy by end of 2006. Introduce the Amman as a resilience strategy. Resilience strategy was issued in 2017, focusing on environment and citizen well-being. In 2021, initiated an Amman Green City Action Plan to systematically address the environmental issue, include waste management, and now we have a private company owned by the municipality to get an opportunity to private sector to manage waste management in the city. This will give an opportunity to open new jobs and new businesses. Water, urban planning and transportation, and we have also a company owned. It has been, I think, 2021 has been issued on a public transport company owned by the municipality, and this is the first time in Jordan, a company owned by the municipality, owned by government, and energy efficiency, and all are utilizing electricity net. Launched an Amman Climate Action Plan 2019 and carbon neutrality to 2050 expanding sectors. Collaborate with local and international agencies, identify priorities, and connect environmental challenges with the sustainable infrastructure investment and policies. This report resulted in 37 initiatives to enhance sustainability by 2025. This is the Amman Green City Action Plan. It has been a short Amman resilience strategy and Amman action. Okay, vegetation, climate change impact in Amman. Of course, climate change impact in Amman. Amman is facing a climate change, as I told you, by irregular rainfall, temperature extremely. This summer is very hot in Amman. The temperature will rise 45 degrees Celsius is never been there. Green growth policies also being expanded in the reforesting the city, but we have a suffering from lack of land belonging to the government. All lands are belonging to private sector, so we are looking for a new opportunity for green the cities, such as urban planning and urban farming. We have a cooperation and a partnership with you to be going for urban planning. Ambitious climate goal. Amman is a member of the C40 network. Cities committed to climate action plan change has ambitious climate goals to aim to develop plan to achieve greenhouse gases. Vegetation climate change impact in Amman collaborative approach. We are working all together to develop an action plan with the national government, because municipality is not Amman. A Greater Amman municipality is not a local government, it's a municipality. It's somehow different system as a policy from local government. Collaboration with the government, private sector, and some universities, as a university, German University and Jordan University. Continuous improvement done by reviewing the strategic plan of Amman and the vision of sustainability of the city. Amman envision becoming a carbon neutral and climate resilience by 2015, driven by green circular economy that promotes urban well-being, inclusively, and cultural and mental competition. What type of successful environment initiative has been implemented? Okay, smart city. This is what has been implemented. We are starting by smart city, and the action plan has been issued. And now we are going to proceed with smart city, efficiency energy and building, and promote efficiency and resilience energy system building, including incentives for green building projects and low carbon mobility. GAM emphasize and accelerated the diverse low carbon mobility system, including the initiatives such as bus rapid transit and BRT, which belong to the GAM. It's all expands the public transport network and implementing traffic monitoring. Climate adaptation, and also transient green economy. So our initiative, circular economy practice, although it's one of the, this is some of our picture. Public transportation, as I told you, and it was an environmental initiative in Amman, and community development. Now, it's Amman, is Amman Listen. We have a bigger project for Amman Listen, resilience and leadership. And thank you very much.
My name is Omar Masud. I'm the Chief Executive of the Urban Unit. I was here also last year saying very profound things. That Victoria has eliminated plausible deniability. Yes, I said that. So I'm not going to repeat it again. In fact, we are not even going to talk about financing. So my title was Field Notes of Policy Making. It was not because I was being ethnographic about it. I just wanted to make it sound interesting. So but I hope you would like this presentation. So, you know, in our policy world, when we talk about environment and urbanization, we talk about jurisdiction. So if you look right at the center, this is what the province of Punjab is. It's 127 million people, 41% is rural, urban, and 60% is rural. By 2042, these ratios would reverse themselves. We have got 9 divisions and 36 districts, but right at the bottom, we've got 5 megacities, 1 megacities and 4 going to be megacities, and 194 cities and towns. So in the next 25 years, it is expected that an additional 40 million people will live in urban Punjab. This is something that we do when we are in spare time. We try to compare, our districts with countries and say, I mean, we got the whole word of it. So, just ignore that. That was just to keep the balance for the slide. This is important. So when I look at urbanization and environment, we tend to look at Lahore because that's where the urban unit is. But we are trying to look at the entire province. So this is a provincial picture. Every dot is representing an urban settlement. So it can be a mega city, it can be a large city, it can be 13 intermediate cities, 38 small cities, and 138 towns. And this is in 2017 under the Punjab Spatial Strategy. Let's look at the picture in 2047. We'll have 1 mega city, we'll have 13 large cities and 43 intermediate cities, 73 small cities and 65 towns. Let's compare it. And I mean, this is an amazing set of slides, but the third one is also going to blow your mind. This one is about the growth rates. And if you look at the growth rates, it's all over the place. It's around the large cities. So the smaller cities which are surrounding the large cities, they are going to experience very large growth rates. But that is also in the south, which is considered to be less urban. Look at the south. I mean, these might be smaller cities to start with, but they are actually, we looked at the census data from 1998 to 2017. The 2023 data was not available with us. But these are the type of growth rates which Punjab is experiencing. Before I go to this slide, and if you keep on looking at this slide, sort of memorize it and then go on to the difficult climate modeling ones. Look at this one and this one. This is RCP 8.5 and the middle row is RCP 4.5. And if you look where the cities are and just look at where the climate change is going to be from the point of view of maximum and minimum temperature, I will not even go into the precipitation one. So we sort of roughly figure out that about 60 urban population in 11 cities can be affected, almost 62% of the urban population by a climate change of 2 degrees centigrade and above. 34% of the urban population in 9 cities can be affected by a 7% precipitation change under RCP 8.5. So when we talk about cities as being an adaptive strategy for climate change, you can see the relationship in Punjab. We are right at the cusp. Our cities can become a problem or they can actually become an opportunity. So we are really at the crossroads of these things. Let's look at what else is happening in the city. So industry, Gharad talk about, cities having this agglomeration effect. Well, 60% of the firms are located within the city boundaries. I'm talking about both informal and formal sector. 20% are within 20 kilometers and 9% within 50 kilometers. But this is important. 90% of the industries and municipalities discharge untreated water into river streams. And that is also sort of increased population load and industrial use is also affecting our water availability and draw per capita. So 882 cubic meters is the water availability per capita, and we are drawing at 1069 cubic meters per capita. Let's look at transport. We have provided 1,600 buses in 7 cities of Punjab. We actually need 3,800. Again, this number is a bit suspect because if you look at the private sector transport provision, these are not customized public transport buses. This is just private sector transport. So getting a bus registered. So if you have a big car, you can actually get it registered as a bus. That's not a problem. That thing can happen. So I would not go by these registration numbers very faithfully. But that bottom one is, bottom two are very important. There has been a 300% increase in the number of two-wheelers in 10 years. That means because the public transport system is failing, the middle class and the lower income is going towards a cheaper two-wheel transport, fossil fuel. And especially in the last 10, 15 years, since Chinese imports have been so much cheaper, the conversion to two-wheel transport, so bicycles have been abandoned and people have gone into two-wheel transport. This is sort of important. Where we stand in terms of the institutionalization of climate change. Now, the next 3-4 slides, I will not ask you to sort of start reading the slides, but just follow me on this one. So here you have this red row representing the timeline of the federal government. The blue or green or magenta is the province of Punjab, and this gray one over here is the local governments. Okay, and just keep looking at the timeline. So 1974 to 1993, all action is at the federal government level. Not much of action, but in whatever they are doing in 20 years or so, they end up with national environmental quality standards or they were adopted. Whether they were implemented, but you can see how could they be implemented? They had hardly any infrastructure at the provincial or the local government level. So let's run it. Let's run this timeline. Again, flatlining, both at the provincial. Here, again, there's nothing at the local government level, but even at the federal government level, things start going a bit, upside down. So Ministry of Environment sort of is shut down. A disaster management ministry is set up. 2011, they upgraded to Ministry of Climate Change. And then in 2013, the Ministry of Climate Change is downgraded to a climate change division and becomes part of the Cabinet Secretariat. And then 2015, they upgraded again to the Ministry of Climate Change. And so you keep moving forward, but you see after 2017, things start falling in place as far as the federal and the provincial governments are concerned. Just look at the timeline between 2017 and 2021. Things are happening, our national transport policy, alternative renewable energy policy. Over here at the provincial level, more policies and more structures are being built. And then the Supreme Court also comes in. So the courts also start intervening in the environment at the federal and the provincial level. Well, the local governments do not have anything to say because they don't have any provision. And so it goes on. And the gray line stays flat. Well, I just found out a couple of weeks ago that they finally got something over here. The local governments have been now allowed to allocate land for EV charging stations. So that's their first win, but that's an important win. From an urban perspective, getting land for an EV charging station is a big, big deal. And if you have an inside track, I would ask you to start buying land as quickly as possible. So specialized institutions at the federal level, yes, but we never had a National Clean Air Act. We still do not have a Provincial Clean Air Act. And the newly formed Local Government Act 2022 has no provision. Well, I just found out one. And now if you start looking at so many policies and so many acts and frameworks, just look at climate change as a potential risk at the federal level. We are looking at the federal level. Arrangements for impact mitigation and climate response actions and targets. You see there's a lot of yeses. Some it's even Steven when it comes to impact mitigation, but when it comes to targets, well, we are not so enthusiastic about setting targets for ourselves. We have bureaucracies after all, and this is the provincial level. You see the yeses sort of diminish, and there are a lot of quickly. Let me sort of Wrapping it up, I'll say implementation framework connecting national, provincial and local stakeholders is very sketchy and centralized and works under a committee system. You make a good set of regulations, but for the implementation framework, you just come up with committees which will occasionally or periodically meet or never meet, and that's why they are weak. So list of policies is identified, but policy alternatives and connections are not clearly identified. So, if you are thinking of introducing EV two-wheelers, you need to get in touch with the transport department, you need to get in touch with the Ministry of Trade because a lot of imports would be taking place. You need to have the science and technology and the local government people for the EV charging station, but that type of a connection is not being made in our policy framework. Evaluation criteria, obviously, because the first two are not there, 3 or 4 are naturally corollary to that. Evaluation criteria for different policy outcomes are missing in most policies, and policy outcome matrix clearly identifying outcomes is not given. The bottom one is, which I added, is new data, is it creating more complexity or adding simplicity to our policy frameworks? That is about it. I was told to remain within 10 minutes, and I hope I have done that job successfully. Thank you.
Well, so is that fine? You got the projector is kind of in your face. Is that okay? Yeah. If it's okay for you, it's no problem.
We figure out the technology.
It's the right color.
Yeah. Go green.
Just turn out.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Perfect. Okay.
Just the budgets.
Thank you so much, Dr. Masud and Dr. Al-Mhairat, for those really valuable insights. I'm going to be coming, as I said earlier, to the audience in just a couple of minutes for your questions. So please do start thinking of them, carry on thinking about them, and we'll come back to that now. But in the meantime, I'll kick us off with a couple just based on the sort of most recent discussions. So I think, Dr. Masud, you're talking a lot about the sort of governance structure of green interventions, I guess, for lack of a better term. And I think, reflecting on how little is in place at the local level, and how it sort of differs across sort of national, regional, and local. And Dr. Al-Mhairat, you also mentioned, particularly around the ownership of land and how there's not a lot in the sort of public domain. And I know that GAM in particular has quite a unique governance structure that might not be applicable to many other cities. So I wonder if you could both just say a little bit about that and how you find it sort of impacts on the coordination and implementation of sort of more sustainable policies. And Gharad, sorry, I haven't got a specific question for you, but general for reflections on that as well. So over to you, Dr. Masud.
Yes, why sort of I emphasize on the legal and the regulatory part of it is that in policy making, you really need to have laws and regulations, not because it's a necessity, because these laws and regulations are also going to lay claim to certain funding and resources. This is very critical. Why do we make so many policies, in the sense of regulation? It's not, well, it sort of adds to the regulatory burden on citizens and firms. I understand that. But also sometimes the strategy, and especially when it comes to climate change and environment, is we need to have these frameworks in place, because then I need a budget line under which I can actually budget these actions. Yes, the first time around, the implementation part of it is obviously weak, but I would not sort of say because these things are not being taken seriously, it has taken almost half a century to get where we are in Pakistan, so let's abandon it. I think we are now right at the stage that where we have a set of legal frameworks. And when it comes to financing, the financing issue, it is these laws that they need or regulations that need to be improved further so that you can get those necessary resources either domestically or even through some type of international financing. That is one reason that we have what we have. It's not just a randomized, sort of an approach. So I'll stop here and let Mervat answer the rest.
very loose, excuse Mike. I agree with the professor about the legal scope. In policymaker, in government, especially public sector, the first thing you have to put in your mind is the legal scope. Then the financial issue, the financial resources you have, the need of the people. Okay, the need of people is the motivator and the guideline for everything. But sometimes the financial resources is not available, so I can't do anything for these needs. So lack of land, yes, we have our own budget. Lack of land, the land on private sector, it's belonging to individuals or the private sector. It's owned by the private sector. In public, let's say public only lands are not only for GAM, it's also for governments. So the relation between the national governments and the municipality or the local governments is somehow they believe in that the local government, we are not local governments in GAM. Okay, we have our own law, we have our own budget, but we don't have local government. We are not evidently moving and taking a decision about the own land owned by the municipality. So we need to go to the national government and the need of the national government, then we use this land for our own. So the relationship, I think, when we want to take a decision in the policymaker, you have all points better. I want to go back to the data and the data and figures, numbers. Most of the cities lack of data and numbers. So they can, all the time, the decision based on assumption or based on opinion of our policymaker or based on need. This is the motivator, not in figures and
I think sort of adding to what she has just said, when we look at Amman and when we look at the example of Punjab, you will clearly see that Punjab has an identity issue as far as cities is concerned. Jordan does not have one because Amman is the city.
Yes.
It's so clear and so evident. In my map, see the biggest problem that I have in my in the map of Punjab is where do I actually place my resources? Which is the best city to save at the moment? Should I sort of struggle in Lahore or should I salvage Saiwal, which looks a much more sort of a potential candidate and can be easily sort of retrofitted, for climate change, whether it is adaptation or, mitigation. Another sort of thing which I did not mention is our intercity connectivity is excellent, but intra-city connectivity is short. Now, why I say this is because if you look at the Punjab city map, here you are a household and you say, should I travel inside Lahore and travel an hour, or should I go to Gujranwala, which is 40 miles away, but that's on an intercity road? That's pretty much clear. So if you look at Lahore and if you look at the sort of a detailed map of Lahore, the city at the moment is hollowing out. The inner city, which was really at some time a very vibrant commercial hubs, you don't see that type of a development. And in fact, the city is sort of growing commercially more at the edges and sort of sprawling out at the edges. So, somebody said in the earlier presentation, design or the shape of the city. I think that is extremely, extremely important when it comes to, policy making, but we are not looking at that thing. We really need to look at that thing. It's very context specific. Yes.
Great. Yeah, I think the interaction between the shape of the city and the boundaries of the governance structures is another interesting one to unpack.
Can I just ask, why is no public transport built within Lahore? What's the difference between intercity and intracity?
Yeah, that's a great question, because the intercity transport, the government investment was in the road connectivity, and Ijaz knows it for decades. Every government has sort of had a great public sector road program, and they've invested it so much that now that we've got excellent connectivity. But the difference between that, in the intercity, we allowed the private sector to come very early on. very, very early. In the 1990s, the Punjab Road Transport Corporation was disbanded. The private sector came in. And now it's a very sort of a burgeoning type of a private sector when it comes to intercity transport. We don't have any public sector intercity transport. It's in the city. I think remnants, or I'm not going, but it's in the city that there's still a debate going on that should the public sector do it or should the private sector do it. Now, this is interesting. Whenever the investment amount becomes big, especially in intracity transport, and that too is determined by civil servants like me, we sort of tend to assume the role that this is now going to be public sector. Nobody tells us that you have to do it. We have never sort of approached the private sector that this is the type of investment we want to make in intracity transport. Are you interested in that? And what the private sector is really interested is in the routes. So if you give them profitable routes, they'll run the buses, they'll bring in the rolling stock, they are ready to do that investment. And somehow, I think this is more of an organizational issue. These routes are not being sort of competitively, so intercity, Punjab Road Transportation Corporation was closed down. It was loss making way back in the 1990s. And intercity, I mean, you don't see people hitchhiking. Everybody has access to all type of public transport, poor to high stock. Yes.
Any other academic insights to the discussion, or can I move on to the next question? Yeah. Okay.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, for sure.
In some big cities, or government has invested in the basic infrastructure for intracity. Like carriageways, etc. Is there any likelihood of government letting private sector companies operate buses on those? For example, the green lines. Yes, it could be used much more intensively if there are no roads. That's it. And there's no talk of line.
There was and sort of that was sort of a split decision. Now I'm talking hardcore policy making. The government wanted to come with the German rolling stock. The private sector wanted to come with the Chinese manufacturer, which were at half the price. And obviously, the government side said that you cannot trust the Chinese. This is just crap. What they are going to do. The very notion that if a private sector entrepreneur is earning profit, but is actually providing good public service and there is an improvement in public service, why should I get a sleepless night on that? I sort of at a personal level challenge that. But some of my colleagues feel that this extra normal profit, if they get a good route and they sort of run a bus and they get like 20 to 30, 40% return, this is not on. This has to be sort of regulated. I don't see it this way. I think we really need to break this, cycle which has been going on continuously.
In Amman, transport lines and company for bus and Amman bus, it's owned by GAM. It's a company belongs to them. It's Oya company. It's so to make a balance for the price for the public, for the citizen. So it's not right because there's another type of public transport owned by private sector. This type is owned by government, but it's with partnership with private sector.
It's a subsidy issue, see, when it comes to public transport.
Great. I'm going to hold my second question because we're running out of time. So I'm going to turn to the audience. If you could raise your hands if you have any questions. I've got one at the back there. Go ahead.
So thank you to all three speakers for an interesting session. I noted that in the second part, we talked about taking laws as a given and saying whatever we do has to be within the framework of the law. A comment or a question is, well, laws are endogenous in some sense, right? They respond to the very, they have to be designed with these pressures in mind. In my research, which I'll present tomorrow, was that judiciaries kind of need a seat at this table, right? Because they have to defend and, enforcement and defending the law they are in some sense at that last line. And Gharad, to your point about data, I think thinking about data as a public good, judiciaries across the world struggle to figure out what's really happening when, a law is contested. Sometimes a law that appears to be in a case that appears to be in the public interest is actually not. And it's really science and objective science that's needed. So one just comment is it would be important to bring judiciaries into this conversation about policy making and evaluation and data gathering. The politicization of data is a challenge of our time.
2 more questions and then we'll come back to it. So there's another one up here. Richard, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, the presentation on Amman, which thank you very much, was mentioned incentives. Those of us working on Uganda have been working very hard to discipline tax incentives because it undermines the revenue base, and the revenue base is very small already. I wondered how effective your incentives were in targeting the externalities, as Gharad mentioned, and what sort of mechanisms have you sort of put in place to monitor the effectiveness to ensure that you're getting a bang for your buck from the incentives?
Great, thank you.
Thank you, first of all. This was a question that came up when Dr. Al-Mhairat talked, so feel free to answer, but also anyone. You mentioned heat is a problem, as an increasing problem. We know that heat gets trapped in cities, and we know that more people will move to cities such as Amman, right? And we also know that the cities that we have today are where the cities were that we had 50 years ago, right? There's a lot of path dependency. So the city structure in 2050 will look very similar to what we are building right now. And so I was wondering whether policymakers in Amman, when they design where to build the next areas, where to allow housing, whether they take that into account, how in 30 years temperature will look like, where the heat islands will be, and how people will, maybe not, but maybe that could be interesting.
Thanks so much. Okay, so we've got a question on including the judiciary and sort of the legal framework within the sort of policy making process. We've got a question around incentives and monitoring the effectiveness to ensure you're getting bang for your buck, and planning ahead in terms of heat mapping and how the city's expanding. So do you want to take any of those questions?
I'm answering from this. About heat, yes, we take in consideration because we have climate change action plan, so it has been consideration to 2015. So the city expanding, now the city of Amman is expanding to the east of Amman. They take it into consideration in the planning for the city. About incentives, can you repeat the question about incentives, please?
So the question around the incentives is that obviously given quite a small revenue base, how do you monitor the sort of effectiveness of different programs to ensure you're actually getting the results for the money?
We have a strong financial programming in the municipality. So the incentives has been given for the business to increase the investment in the city, because we believe that more increase investment in the city, and I think next cycle the city will be move on, and a lot of people will be fine, and everything will be going. So incentives is based on what type of district we give. And not sometimes there is a point for rebuilding is hard, for example, because we have a lot of people doing some incentives maybe moderate, for example, for private public transport. We don't believe in the public transport individually, the public transport. So we don't give it legal scope, yes. Okay, when we develop on a legal, for example, a law or by law, take a long journey. For example, the first time has been issued its own law. So it has been taking a lot of discussion with the citizen, representative, we have a city council, and with NGOs, with the committees, and with so then go to the parliament. So the data must be collected from all of these. But we are talking about the data. We don't have a central department for data. It's available for the decision maker. So when the law out, the data is from here and here and here and here, and the discussion take a long time. For example, the Greater Amman Municipality law take about 3 years for issuing. But if I have a central data department, it will take me shorter than this time. This is what I mean.
Yeah, the first question about law being indigenous, I completely agree it is. And I sort of, further what you said about the Supreme Court or the judiciary getting involved into it, the first thing, the good thing about it is creating space. Lawmaking and regulation is a very closed door exercise. And what the judiciary does, it creates space for experts, outside experts to come in, and also starts looking at data which perhaps the government is not interested in looking at, or intentionally does not want to even talk about that data. So in our case of Lahore, for example, whenever the judiciary has sort of, got involved in anything related to the environment or climate change, it has been very beneficial, and it has allowed agencies like myself, like the urban unit, to sort of piggyback on a court decision or the platform which the judiciary sort of actually provides the urban unit, that this is a safe space. You can just say what you want in your report. It's not going to sort of alienate you with the rest of the government. I think that is a good evolution. The only thing that I actually see for that is that we have to be careful about that between something which is becoming a very positive evolution and something which can become a crusade, at an individual judicial member. And with due respect to the judiciary, it's not sort of casting aspersion on any of the honorable members of it, but urban policy is a very debatable and a very contested issue. When you start talking about it, everybody has an opinion because everybody lives in a city. We are right now in London. I can tell you my opinion. In the last 48 hours that I've been here, the garbage does not get picked up. It's there. It's a weekend. So thank you, Amman Municipality, coming to the rescue of Sadiq Khan will be ready. But still, even if you are for an instance in an urban environment, you want to talk about it. And unfortunately, this should have come through either media or journalism. But if you look at journalism, and Jaz, you are a witness to it, people hardly write about urban issues, and people who used to write about are getting older. SCAs per year, actually pass by. And I really feel that an opportunity is being lost in sort of talking about histories. And that's why the judiciary brings in data, brings in outside experts. It brings a level of neutrality to an exercise, although this is not programmed or it's not planned as such. So that's my answer to this. One thing about the buildings. Well, yes, I completely agree. What we are building now, we are going to see 30 years from hence. And right now, there is a bit of a confusion over here at the policy making level. Number one, building design is harder than urban planning. So anybody who has been an architect would always tell you that the urban planner is a lower grade and the architect is the superior grade. So if you've been to a school of architecture and urban planning, you know by the size of the departments and the funding that where urban planning is. But it is important. It is really important because urban design is something that we are absolutely not looking at in actually developing countries. And that is something that really can help us as far as mitigation and adaptation is concerned. But we are really not looking very hard at it. Points of confusion over there is at a policy making level, and I can relate to you at high level meetings. What is the difference between a net zero building and a green building? And you know, there has been a half-an-hour debate on this one. So everybody comes up. A green building is that anything which goes green, you know. So that is a green building. A net zero building is that there is absolutely no emission actually coming out of it. Now, the concept to describe and put it into a project or a development form becomes harder. So you know that is you know one of the challenges. And the third question escapes my mind. Incentives, yes. Incentives again. You know, how do you sort of? It really depends. It really depends upon the sort of prominence which is actually given to a particular area or a theme or you know an urban issue. If there is prominence given to it, you'll get the incentive for it. For example, the Orange Line had a massive incentive, you know, to subsidize, you know, travel, which allowed the metro, which allowed and which runs at 100% capacity. Now time has come, 10 years after the metro running, that we really need to do a study of what has been the effect of metro in terms of job opportunities between the city of Kasur, which is a smaller intermediate city outside Lahore, and this effect of metro. It has changed lives, you know. I strongly believe, but you know, these stories really need to be told.
On the judiciary thing,
yes,
there is a IGC research project by Michael Greenstone's research project on air quality, which actually engages with the judiciary very effectively. So you may want to talk with the team.
Thank you.
Great. Gharad, on incentives, you've got to have something to say.
I would just give some nerdy academic responses to all three questions at the same time. And I guess I really liked the term of data as a public good. And I think that, you know, over the last 20 or so years, economists have become obsessed with data and we've become obsessed with identification and causality. And I think we haven't done as good a job as we should have done in explaining to other people how useful those things are.
Yes.
So that's two fronts. I mean, we were on your question, we were talking, Vicky and I, with people from Accra, and one of the big problems in Accra is flooding. And we were told that they do not, at the city level, have accurate flooding maps to understand where you would want to build that. So the data is not getting collected, and I think that's because we're not doing a good enough job of explaining what you would do with it. And the same goes for any of our efforts to establish causality. We spend a lot of time working on these things, but then it's very easy to glaze over in my presentation when I start talking about differences, and I don't think we're communicating the value of this, which means we're not gathering that public good as well as we could. I think that responds. Oh, and of course, data is essential for.
Can I add a quick writer on your question about data? Just that we are at IGC, we have underway a sort of data initiative, and we're trying to feel our way into where demand and usefulness is greatest, both on the policymaker side and on the researcher side. Shahid, who's sitting in the front, who's the head of research program, is leading this. We'd love to have people get in touch about it and say, you know, with your ideas about where the value would be particularly high. We're obviously going to be a small player, so we want to focus our efforts where we think we can make the most difference. But you know, we agree. We've come to the conclusion now that it's an extremely important issue for us, and we have a number of things underway in individual countries, but are keen to learn more about, you know, where we might add value.
Omar sits on a huge data bank.
Yes, so
which he's willing to share.
Oh, okay.
You're working on these quietly silent about it.
No. I'm because you know that was sort of my you know, nice sitting there. So we here at the Urban Unit have now made a strategic, and my board has allowed me that we need to make available data to the general public. And by the general public, I mean not only in Pakistan, but also, abroad, number one. And one thing, if we ever get the time to do that MOSA dashboard presentation, really now the type of data sets which the urban unit took us a decade. So I showed you that sort of a diagrammatic of divisions, districts and towns, but our lowest sort of administrative unit is a MOSA, and there are about 25,000 of them. In the province of Punjab, we mapped 22,000 digitally. Now we got sort of a base map of a MOSA, and now all I need, and I need IGC help and all the students and researchers over here, go ahead and populate that, base map. I need to develop layers, and layers which can actually give you an intuition. When we talk about climate change and when we talk about migration, I would really like to see which villages and which clusters are going to be most affected, because I've got the cropping patterns also. So if I put in the cropping patterns and I have the MOSA jurisdiction, I can really tell that what is going to happen to the fate of these 3 or 4 villages in the MOSA, if the rainfall is going to be excessive or if the temperature is going to go up and down. What is going to be the effect on crop yields? Because now even crop yields are being digitized. They are being digitally monitored. Monitored through humans, but still they are being digitally monitored. So there is a lot of data exhaust actually coming up. One thing we need to agree to is that digitization has been going on in the developing world for quite some time, since the smartphone and since everything. So it's been going on for decades. And there is a lot of data exhaust and silos of data which are lying around, which you can play around with. The maps which I showed you, they were not made with the intention to present here at LSE. They were actually prepared for a housing market information system, for which I needed the population demand in various areas. So that's how things that we want.
Add something. Okay, we need the data, but how to analyze this data and get out the benefit.
That's the last one.
That's where he comes in. Yes,
That's what I'm saying. I don't think
this is the
we've convinced ourselves how to do it.
Yeah.
Not really convinced everyone else.
Yes.
So I think
Great. So we've come to the end of our time. I wanted to give each of the panelists 1 or 2 seconds before we go around. 2 sentences. I think, Gharad, I know you had another point to make, but just so highlighting what you think is the most urgent thing for researchers in this room to be thinking about in terms of urbanization and climate change. So we'll start with Ms. Al-Mhairat. For Amman and everyone in the room who's listening.
I think Earth is warning the climate changes and dangers. When previously anybody talking about the climate change, we thought it's not true. It's something from illusion. But I think we need all to think together now how we can make an accurate and action plan, not a strategic plan, an action plan how to face climate change. Yesterday and before, it was hard to picture in London. I think it's something amazing, and I need to do that in London. So we need to face all together the climate change. It's more responsibility all over the world. Not an Amman, not in London, not in London. We need to think all together how to save our world.
Great. Dr. Masud, 1 line?
One line I would have been sort of associated with the work which IGC has been doing for now a couple of years. I think there is a global community. I could not count only the urban unit. There are so many other. There in Pakistan. So we are not on a weak foundation. At the moment, we are looking far ahead, and looks like that these are very distant goals. But I personally believe that these are not distant goals, and I would urge everybody, like when I was sort of struggling with my own PhD, to just hang in there and just sort of face forward and keep on going at it. The first data set, the first regression is not going to work, nobody is going to understand. The policymakers would be always skeptical of the difference in difference and instrument variables. And what I saw in the last 5 sessions is sort of all right nightmares. I think there is a bright future, and I've been at it for 2 years. I'm looking at it very positively. And if you compare it what we were discussing 2 years ago, and I think you would have the recorded rooms of it, because you just sort of checked me out on that profound deliberation that without resources, you just cannot get anyway. But there is a caveat to it. You have to have a proof of concept. You have to show performance to get resources. So while you might think that this thing is not going anywhere, the policymakers are being very skeptical. If you show something and convey it and present it in a very effective way, you can actually get things done. Thank you.
Great, Gharad? Last line?
So one comment on things I think need to be researched. So I think a lot about migration, and when I tend to think about migration, I think about this amazing government of a country that can try and control migration within a country and do all sorts of things. And then when we see these wonderful presentations, they tell us the facts about the fragmentation of the political economy of making choices around migrants. You start as a migrant in one municipality, you move across all sorts of boundaries into another place where you're in a subset of a city where there's a complicated environment there. And we don't even have the tools at the moment, as far as I know, to think about those issues. And so if I were a graduate student, I would start thinking about those issues. The same goes within cities, because we're not going to get any government action unless we know how to think about all those interactions.
Great, now we can have the rest. A couple more announcements. So if you want to hear more from Dr. Masud today, please do stick around for the public lecture this evening. It'll be at 6:30 p.m. in the old theatre of the old building.
That's what this was my qualifying lab, so the great Formula One is about to start.
We've also got a really exciting webinar coming up on the 21st of September with Gharad and Jill Frontier from Urban Economics. So if you are planning on coming we have just some policy briefs on the way out if you want to see.